Welcome to the Programming Lions podcast. Today we have a unique episode, for sure, the most unique that we have ever recorded, and definitely the longest. Pablo joins us, a young man, very sharp, very well read, articulate, and he had reached out saying he had some unique views, particularly on anarchism and communism. And he thought it would be valuable for our audience to share those. And I met with him in advance, and I was just impressed with his demeanor and his calmness and his openness to questions and pressure testing some of these ideas. And so we decided to have him on. Now, this is not a light topic and not one you can cover in 20 minutes. And so we got going, and it just kind of kept rolling. This episode may not be for everyone. It's fairly long, but if you are interested in understanding how an anarchist and a communist think, what are some of these ideas, and pressure testing a lot of these ideas, the second half of this interview, we really go into depth in pressure testing scenarios, issues on both the ideologies as well as like real world applications. That part is where, for me, it got really fun and interesting. However, in the beginning, we kind of lay out the ideas and the frameworks and all of that. Take a look at the timeline if you want to pop into different areas within the conversation. This was a marathon. In fact, the boys cashed out about halfway through it because it did get pretty detailed and pretty advanced. But Pablo is a senior in high school and he's 17 years old, and you'll find that he has studied this quite a bit. So without further ado, let's get into it. Pablo, welcome to the Programming Lions podcast. We're excited to have you on. Just a little bit of backstory on you. You reached out to us over social media in good faith and very politely, and you said, hey, I've got some different views. I'd love to come on and share some of those views with you and your audience to give you like a little bit more exposure and context of some other ideas that are out there. And we're open to other ideas, especially if they're in good faith and polite. And so we're excited to talk about some complex governance topics today. But before we get into all that, how about you give us a little bit of background, about yourself?
Yeah, so hello, my name is Pablo Valenzuela. I'm a senior and I do debate, specifically Lincoln Douglas. Politically, I'm an anarchist as well as a communist. More often, I go under the label anarcho-communist. I'm read up on Marx and a lot of anarchist theory. And yeah, and I just come to introduce you guys and discuss that and see your guys' understanding.
Okay. Well, I think it's fair to say that our understanding of communism and anarchism is fairly limited. We've done some reading and research. And so part of what we want to do is learn from you today and maybe pressure test some of the common critiques that those ideas get, and we can bring that to our audience and go from there. So this is, and just for the audience's sake, like, this was not intended as a debate. You're a debater, so you'd probably dust us anyway, but this is really intended for us to learn and, like I said, pressure test some of the common critiques that these ideas hear, and see what we take away from it.
Disclaimer, my anarchist views may not align with the entire body of other anarchist views or other communist views. Communism and anarchist are a broad term and different ideas apply. However, I'm just educating on my beliefs on anarchism and communism and my understanding. So first, 3 terms that I want to ask you guys about. What do you guys think Marxism, communism, and anarchism are? You can go list by whichever one you want. So what are your guys' understanding of those topics?
Well, I know a little bit more about communism, but I'm pretty sure communism and Marxism are like almost the same thing. And I mean, like, where everybody gets like the same.
Okay, you believe that communism is where everyone gets the same, right? That's your understanding?
Basically, yeah.
Okay. Do you guys know what anarchism is?
Not really.
Not really, yeah.
Okay. So first off, I want to kind of just start off on communism and Marxism. So Marxism is specifically the philosophy and a method of analysis specifically that Marxist-Leninists use, which refers to dialectical materialism. Although Marxism refers to the entirety of the body of philosophy that Marx and Engels as well and is sometimes grouped up with Leninism, which is also the philosophy that he's written. When communists refer to Marxism, they're really referring to the system of analysis referred to as dialectical materialism and dialectical historics, right? Where they analyze how material conditions shape history, right? And how these things impact. So I know that sounds like
those are some big words.
yeah, those are some big words. So
And for the record, like I'm more studied up on this than the boys, obviously, but I have not read in entirety any of Marx's works. If you were to suggest somebody read one of Marx's works, where would you have them start?
Yeah, so the foundational work that Marx actually has is actually something that people get really confused is that they believe that the Communist Manifesto is one of Marx's foundational work. When really
that's the one that as most people are familiar or have heard about.
When really what the Communist Manifesto was a pamphlet to get other communists riled up and to explain and introduce the cause. However, the most foundational Marx work that we analyze is Das Kapital, which is which is an economic paper as well as a political paper, political text which analyzes capitalism and an interaction. So just before I get into that, I'm going to go more in depth into communism and anarchism, but just so you know, dialectical materialism in really simple words, even though it's a very complex way of looking at it, and something that you as someone who's understanding communism don't really have to like look into at the very beginning of your journey of understanding it, but something that is a little more complex. But basically, in simple words, it's a way of analyzing how historical events and material conditions, so the conditions that people live under and certain things, impact and influence politics and society. And there's different branches of that theory that go into that. But yeah, also on top of that, I wanted to ask you guys, so is there anything else you guys know about communism other than it's where everybody gets the same thing?
I'm pretty sure most countries most countries in like Asia have tried it and they failed. And then like I think the only current communist countries are like North Korea and like kind of China.
The other thing historically is fairly like well known that communism is responsible for more deaths than any other governance system that's been tried or attempted. That's something I think of with communism.
Well, see, this is a very common narrative and critique that actually goes into communism. However, a lot of there's the one of the reasons that historics in terms of communism is very hard to dive into is because even Western historians or academic bodies highlight and have a lot of intrinsic biases in terms of interpreting these things. This is actually one of the things that I began looking into as I began to understand communism and how it interacts. My parents personally grew up in a country that is run by a communist party from Cuba. So I really began to, so in my journey, when I was beginning to understand communism, I began to look at what my parents are saying, and then I was like, okay, this is interesting. And then I began to read and I began to have discussions with them on how this actually interacts, and how this actually tracks with, real foundational evidences. And one of the critiques, even though I personally am not I wouldn't refer to myself as a Marxist-Leninist, I would refer to myself more as an orthodox Marxist and specifically an anarchist. One of the beliefs of the Marxist-Leninist is that socialism has to be scientific, right? We need to base it on some sort of method of analysis and some sort of factual methodology for it to actually function, right? So that's when I began to apply this idea of dialectics into my understanding. I began to actually study the historical conditions, right? And a lot of the narratives that come to communism has caused direct deaths, is not one that is foundationally based on without biases, right? And that's something that a lot of people misunderstand about communism.
So what would be a simple way to put it? Would you say that Stalin, Mao, like those are not were they not pure communists? Is that the argument?
No. So for specifically Mao and Stalin, there is some there's almost no argument that Lenin was or fully tied and believed into his communist ideology. However, Stalin is one that is more critiqued, specifically in anarchist spaces, which is why it's important for me to be an anarchist, because part of my anarchist belief comes from, looking at historical analysis and actually critiquing, Marxist Leninist leaders, right? So
what's the uniqueness about anarchists? So it's like, is it a form of communism without hierarchical structures? Like help me understand what the uniqueness is.
So first off, anarchism is a name that gets a lot of bad traction, and that's because people don't
it
really
has kind of it almost sounds like you're blowing things up, right? But that's not from a a political or a governance structure. That's not what it means, right?
Yeah. So anarchism is the belief that we should deconstruct hierarchy as a whole, and along with that is that there is no necessity for states to exist, right? So for a lot of people, that's a hard pill to swallow. It's like, whoa, that sounds crazy. Like, what do you mean states shouldn't exist? What do you mean hierarchy shouldn't exist, right? And one of the key things that you have to understand here when you're reading into anarchism is that anarchism isn't about hierarchy that we will. It's about hierarchy that is coercive, right? So a teacher-student relationship that I agree upon and that I consent to under my own free will is not hierarchy in the terms of the anarchist lens. Rather, there are other, components of hierarchy that are more in tune with what the anarchists are referring to.
That would say that there's no hierarchy, there's no leadership, there's no authority, there's no so when I think about North Korea, right? You've got a leader over that. In an anarchist model, you would not have a leader. It would be
So that's it. So here's the thing, right? Is that for some people, they read into communism and they read into anarchism, and they're like, wow, how are these related? How can you be an anarchist and a communist? However, the end goal of a communist society, which is something I'm going to go more in depth into later, is a stateless, moneyless, and classless society, which is, the three tenets that people actually refer to. That isn't a specific a specific way of referring to communism under the text. Rather, it's the goal or the end goal of communism. While anarchism also seeks to achieve stateless, moneyless, and classless society. So communism, or Marxist-Leninism, which is the most popular mode of an understanding of communism, has the same goal as anarchism. However, our difference is how we get there and how we achieve that.
Okay. And then I know I asked this as kind of a tangent question with anarchism, but back to a common critique you hear about communism is Mao, Stalin, like death toll from communist regimes is massive. What do people get wrong with that?
Yeah, so here's one understanding or one confusion here is that there is an issue with analysis in terms of these places, Mao and the USSR. There are different historical conditions as to why these occurred and different reasonings. So first off, let's look into Mao, right? Now, Mao was, although I'm not personally a Maoist, there's a lot of confusion that comes under Mao. Like, there is no set understanding of the real number of deaths under the famine, which is, in a way of understanding history, that's kind of insane, right? Is that we don't have a set number, because I've heard anywhere from 15 million to 80 million. I heard 80 million the other day, and it's like, wow, that's a huge confusion. So there's a common misconception there, and people take the most commonly accepted number, or amongst historians, is 30 million. People hear that, and they hear the issue with Mao, and they're like, wow, communism led to this. However, this isn't, we can study scientifically in terms of the condition of China beforehand and afterhand, right? So when we look at communism, I think the best way to evaluate how communist systems have worked is that we want to look at the position of the state before communism and after communism, right? Because if before communism, right, there were billions of billions of people dying, And then after communism, there were 10 million people dying. The 10 million people weren't caused by communism. If anything, the decrease was referred to as communism, right? That's a more extreme example. So with Mao, for example, famines were not uncommon in China. While a lot of Maoist critiques and specific critiques of Mao are that there was a mishandling of the agriculture that occurred, famines were not uncommon into China. In fact, the deaths from the famine that occurred after the Great Leap Forward predating that, there were also famines that occurred under that with similar numbers, right? So these things weren't specific to them. It was regular, or it was normal for famines to occur under China.
But
however,
they also had people slaughtered for non-compliance, right?
Specifically, who specifically? Like in reference to what?
Well, both Mao and Stalin. Like, if you didn't, I guess, like, if you didn't comply to the system and everything, then you would be, well, taken care of. Like, so there's that too. Like, there's the famine for sure. I think, like, it's a decent point that, like, there's been famine over the course of history in all, especially more old history. Famine was not uncommon, and so I think there's, and we don't have to go into this too much depth, right? But like, I suppose there are arguments the communist structure led to some of the famine, is, I think, part of the argument. But even if we take that out, there was some atrocities that were certainly by these regimes.
Yeah, so see, this is one thing too that you really have to be read up on it to really understand it, and specifically this historically tracks as to why people are so misinformed of communism and actually, like, understand it. So if you've read anything about, do you guys know about the Red Scare and McCarthyism?
I think I've heard of it, but
we have not read it. No,
I know, but I've heard about it. We'd learn about it in history.
Yeah, so in history, you'll learn about McCarthy, right? Who basically what he did was he funneled a bunch of anti-communist propaganda across states, and one of the most important policy decisions that he made was that in Eastern Europe he funded these countries in order to deter them away from communism after the Second World War, right? So this was one of the most important policies that go into depth as to why there is such a weird and complex understanding of communism, right? And the Red Scare. Now onto the deaths of the people, right? So in certain countries, right, there are certain countries that they are entirely devoid of communist policy, and the only reason they're actually referred to communism is because there is a conflationary idea with authoritarianism and communism, right? So modern day China is I would refer to modern day China as a country with communist ideology and a communist party. However, a country, and in certain aspects they've actually, like, gone away from that, which is very
they've developed free markets even now,
which is very apparent. But countries such as North Korea, there's no indication that they are, in any sense of the word or capacity, actually communist or run under communist ideology. If any, and it goes kind of more in depth into why people are misunderstanding that, right?
This might go into, I think it's a question we had later, boys, around like communist societies. One of the critiques is they are susceptible to authoritarian regime, right? And so that's maybe like a risk of a communist society, is that they're highly susceptible to an authoritarian regime, which I'd say it's maybe fair to say that is what occurred in a lot of these instances, and maybe currently in North Korea. Yeah. So how does one avoid that?
Yeah. So one of the necessary understandings that we have to understand is that communism in nature is anti-authoritarian, right? It seeks the destruction of the state, and it seeks the destruction of the bourgeoisie, which refers to the ruling class, which holds power over the working class. The entire point of communism is to advance the working class, right? And before I go back into that, just going back into what I was saying before with North Korea, is that a lot of those deaths it's two things. It's conflation, right, with things that are not actually communist or socialist in nature. One of the most key examples here, before I go more into that, is the National Socialist Party of Germany, the Nazis. They referred to themselves as socialist and for the working class. However, all of their ideologies were anti-communist in nature. The first people they killed were the communists. They tried to get rid. The first people to die on the not the first people they killed, but the first people who died on the line fighting the Nazis were the communists, right? There was a constant battle. Hitler had adopted the term in order to gain traction with Germany, right? To gain an idea that was popular in order to seize power. However, everything he did was antithetical to the communist cause, which is something that is conflationary. A lot of the deaths, however, are defensible, right? A lot of the deaths that were accounted, a lot of the propaganda that comes into communism has killed this many people. This number comes from a specific historian. I forgot his name specifically, but he counted Nazi deaths as part of the death toll of communism, which is like, wow, that is a very biased critique.
I've heard that too.
Yeah.
I've heard that too. Well, how about this? Instead of talking about the deaths, how about this? When any, let's say, a country that is thought of as communist, when you tear down a wall between East and West Germany, or if you were to tear down the wall between North and South Korea, which way would people be running?
People ran towards, and I'm going to be honest about this, people ran towards the capitalist side, which was Eastern Germany, I believe. Yeah.
And so even if we take, let's say, the death thing out, it would seem that people run towards a free market society. And so if communism is so great, and I even think like Cuba and so forth, like they want to come to a free market nation. And so I feel like, a lot of people advocate for this, but there's this sort of argument that is like, it's just never been done right. And I wonder like how many times it can never be done right before we realize that maybe it's not like feasible.
So here's the thing, right? Here's the nuanced understanding. Here's a more nuanced understanding of this, is that Marx actually refers to why people cling to capitalist society. And he refers to this term, which is why you need to understand communism. And I'm going to go more in depth into that. Oh, before that, yeah, before just the last point about the death thing, I was going to say is that something that you guys have to also understand is that part of these deaths are part of revolution, right? No revolution has ever come, or no real revolution has ever come across with peace or full peace or non-violence, right? Even the revolution of Gandhi, which was a generally peaceful thing, had violence in parts of India. Right. So no revolution has ever come with peace. So it's not necessarily that we're saying that death as a whole or violence as a whole is unnecessary, because in certain material conditions it is necessary. Right. Yeah. And now back. Yeah. So I just want to make sure that you guys had to that is part of how revolution occurs. The American Revolution had deaths and violence. Of course. Right? Yep. Yeah. So one of the critiques, one of the things that Marx discussed is that people are so alienated from their labor that they cling to the material conditions or they cling to the systems that are inherently exploitive of them, right? One thing in Eastern Germany and Western Germany is that in Eastern Germany, which was the Russian side, there were certain conditions that were, the USSR had, especially the USSR had some conditions that were, damaging to them, specifically counter-revolutions that were occurring, famines that were damaging to why, the communist structure has failed, which is part of the reason that as an anarchist, I'm critical of certain foundational ideas of Marxist-Leninists. However, I do understand that there are a lot of biases and a lot of interpretations that I, as an anarchist, can't just avoid. I can't simply defer and say, well, Stalin was, all bad. Stalin was bad because this, and that, right? I need to understand and evaluate the conditions of the working class and how it actually impacted this. Yeah, so that is one of the reasons why people cling to the systems that are exploiting them, which is what the communists believe, that they're exploitive in nature, right? One of the examples you brought up was Cuba, right? And a lot of people don't really understand what's going on in Cuba because they're not read up amongst Cuban people, and they're not read up on literature on what's actually going on. Cuba is one of the things that, as a Cuban myself, I had to actually go in depth and read on, that, experience is good, but knowledge and facts are better, right? the experience of one person doesn't shape the experiences of an entire nation. So I had to understand and read into Cuba. And what I realized and recognized was that there is a strong imperial U.S. force that has occurred over the years, specifically with the Cuban embargo, that has damaged the flourishment of the Cuban people, you know? And another issue that is inherently tied to the Cubans themselves and the Cuban government is the nature of policing in Cuba, you know, which I would argue has moved us away and moved the Cuban people away from the true communist cause, right?
Just to break that down, so you're saying that the reason it hasn't been successful in Cuba is because America's had their thumb on Cuba?
When we evaluate failure and success, right, I think these are generally very subjective terms, right? I wouldn't argue that communism in Cuba has failed, because there are a large group of policies in Cuba that were specifically tied to the communist cause that highlight how the Cuban Revolution was a success, right? So I wouldn't argue that communism in Cuba has failed. I would argue that communism in Cuba has been deterred from its full realization by U.S. imperialism or U.S. forces.
Okay. And your family moved, like, came to the U.S. from Cuba.
Yes.
Why?
So specifically because the Castroist regime, in my opinion, is one of the most damaging regimes to the communist cause and has been authoritarian in nature. And specifically, and as well, because there is a nature of impoverishment in Cuba, right? There are also reasonings behind this, right? The embargo, I would argue, is the key reason for why Cuba has been in such a poverty for years, right? Cuba, pre-existing the Cuban Revolution, was also not a very wealthy country and relied on Cuban exports. However, the difference between the country before the Cuban Revolution and after the Cuban Revolution is that there was a system of hyper-capitalism hyper-capitalist ideology where Batista, who was the pre-existing leader, allowed for slave labor relations and an exploitation of the working class. And then post the Cuban Revolution, there was an emphasis on uniting the working class.
Yeah.
And this was slowed down and deterred by the embargo, which has exacerbated the poverty that has occurred in Cuba.
Okay.
Wait, I just have a question. It's just kind of like a random question. I don't really know if it's a good one or not. But I know that in the Cold War, it was like basically like the western half of Europe, basically, and America versus the USSR, I'm pretty sure. So I'm wondering then, would you then think it would be better if the USSR won and if communism went all the way in through Europe?
If communism had existed in Europe or had benefited the European ideas, it depends on, because this is a hypothetical, it depends on how Stalin would have continued his regime. So it depended on if Stalin specifically was overthrown, and specifically if Stalin had actually stuck to the cause. I'm more read up on Lenin than I am Stalin. However, parts of the reason I'm critical of Stalin is that he championed the state for too long, right? So communism, right, specifically refers to the end goal of a stateless, moneyless class of society, right? And socialism is a broad term, but specifically when Marx refers to socialism, it's the transitionary state between capitalism and communism. And actually, let me rephrase this. Specifically Marxist, Marx specifically, he never referred to socialism. He just used the terms interchangeably. But when Marxists refer to it, they refer to the transitionary state. And something
it's a step on the way. It's basically like Marx refers to socialism as a step towards communism.
Yeah, the Marxists specifically. So the reason, part of the reasoning behind this is that I'm critical of the USSR is because there was an over championship of state capitalism, right? Which is what the socialists refer to it. And Emma Goldman, which is one of the most famous and prolific.
Can I ask you about her? Okay.
Yeah, which is one of the most prolific and communist an anarchist propagandist, has an essay referred to which says there is no communism in Russia, right? Which discusses how Stalin specifically, walked away from his championship or the Marxist ideology. And she's actually Lithuanian, right? And she was an anarchist, but she was still critical of the things. This is where a lot of the battles come between the anarchists and the communists, even though we are mostly united on most issues, is that there are certain critiques. Where is there a real realization of communism? Where is this actually occurring? One of the most famous Cuban revolutionaries, Che Guevara, which led and spearheaded the Cuban Revolution, his grandson was actually arrested by the Castroist regime. He was arrested by Castro police, and that's kind of crazy when you think about it, because it's like the grandson of the revolutionary who was painted on Cuban houses on all over Cuba was arrested by Cuban police. And one of his most famous quotes is that he says, "My grandfather would never stand for this, right? He's an anarchist, and he was anti-Castroist in nature, but he was still a communist. He just had recognized where there was a detachment from communist ideology." Right? So there has to be a reasoning and a lot of nuance between understanding communism and how it actually interacts with the material conditions of society, which is why communists say, hey, communism has to be scientific. It has to be based on an analysis of history, right? We have to take a real world analysis, realize where is praxis being applied? Where is communism actually being applied? How is it helping the regime? How is it helping? How is it actually being applied? Is this communism? And is this functioning dialectically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we have to understand communism. And one of the things that now I've yapped actually a bunch of like actual a bunch of about the conditions of communism.
Yeah.
But I kind of want to I want to go more into what is communism, right? Like, what is communism itself? You guys said, well, communism is where everybody gets everything, right? That's one of the examples of how American propaganda has influenced understanding of communism. Communism refers specifically to the working class seizing the means of production, right? That is the idea of the communists, that the working class should own the means of production and that private property should be abolished. Now, what do you guys think private property is? That's an important question I have to ask you guys.
I think private property is basically like what you own. Because like my private property is, I don't know, my bed. I mean, like
our home, maybe.
Yeah, our home. I like sleep in my bed, really nice. My home is awesome, so I feel like that's private property. But I just have like, did you say like abolish the private property or?
Yes. So here's one thing, right? Now you have you like your bed, right? You like you don't want to give your bed away to someone, right? So that's one of the key issues, is that private property is not personal property. The things you described are personal property. Private property can refer to houses and other things, but your bed and certain things like that refer to personal property. So one of the things I just said there is, wait, your house can be private property, but your bed isn't private property. How does that cross a line?
Yeah.
Right? Here's the thing. Houses can be private property in the way that they function and the way that they're used, right? So what Marx is talking about when he says private property isn't beds or personal property. He's referring to the means of production. So things that produce goods and services, and things that can be used in order to boost the economy and function in terms of actually producing work, right? So
that means basically basically communism with the abolish private property. So that means you would basically give, or I mean, you wouldn't have a house, or would you give it away?
Everybody would have a house under communism. Communism seeks to abolish private property in terms of the owners or the private ownership of private property. The word private, right? Communism doesn't seek to abolish property, it seeks to abolish private property, right? Which is the privatization and the singular ownership of the individual over the means of what is being produced, right?
So that means basically that means that like the person who owns it is not really like the former owner. It's like everyone basically like owns it.
In sort of, in a sense, right? Is that people who work and produce labor are owed their labor, right? So let's go into the house example. Mao, one of the most famous thing that Mao did was kill all the landlords, right? It's like, why did Mao do that? And it's because part of the issues is that there was an exploitation of land ownership in agrarian China, right? Is that China was a feudal society. Do you guys know what feudalism is?
No.
Feudalism predates capitalism, and it's the system, and predates all of these systems. It's the system in which there were landowners and people who lived on these lands, and then they worked in that labor, right? Sort of kind of like slavery, but more complex, or more based on land ownership, right? Is that the reason that Mao killed all these is because they were exploiting the laborers. They were basically slave owners, right? So that's part of the reason that there was a killing of landlords, right? Because they refused.
What if the landlord actually took good care of the people, though, gave them a nice place to stay and a meal for doing the work?
The reality is there wasn't really a nice treatment of the people in almost every situation. And if there was,
we could fast forward it, because I actually am interested in how you apply the same ideas into like today's society of bourgeoisie and proletariat, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people like are skeptical of who's really oppressing who.
Yeah. So killing the landlords, is a step that is far into the revolution,
Yeah. But how about a founder of a company and the people that work in the company?
So specifically a communist revolution in general, right, needs to function with deconstructing these bourgeoisie ideologies, right? And we aren't saying that we need to just kill all the rich, or we need to get rid of the rich people, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. There's some people that advocate for that.
We're not saying
Luigi?
See, that's the thing. Luigi himself, he was a rich guy. He came from private property. So why wouldn't we kill someone like Luigi while we would, kill someone like the insurance guy? It's because Luigi was what Marx refers to as a class traitor. He betrayed his petite bourgeoisie class, or the bourgeoisie class that he actively participated in. So there are instances where people can go into these labors, and the reason that there is any murder or any violence towards these people is specifically because revolution does not occur with nonviolence, and revolution needs to occur when we need to defend ourselves from oppression, right? And there are different reasonings as to why this could occur or how this could occur. One of the key let's look, and I think that for an analysis in terms of America is, let's look at how revolutionaries were battled the state, right? Let's look at someone like Fred Hampton. Do you guys know who Fred Hampton was?
No.
He was a leader of the Black Panther Party, and he formed the Rainbow Coalition, and he started free breakfast programs and free education for the Black communities, and he aligned different communities together in order to support this. And one of the things that occurred was that he was surveillanced by the FBI and then killed in his home. And then when police analysis went into the actual scene and the battle between the Black Panthers and Fred Hampton, they found that the Black Panthers had shot one bullet while the cops had shot 99, right? So there is a constant battle between, states and revolution that is necessary. When does the need for violence occurs? That violence occurs when there is an oppression of the people, right? Look
Who
at the Haitian
decides
Revolution.
if it's oppression or not?
See, this is why we need to look at communism as scientific, right? We need to evaluate where oppression exists, right?
Yeah.
So oppression can be highlighted and viewed by different people, right? And oppression on the communist scale exists in terms of the bourgeoisie, right? It doesn't really exist in the class of the petite bourgeoisie, right? The petite bourgeoisie refers to, so just for understanding of the terms, the bourgeoisie refers to the elite ruling class, which gains power over, or holds power over, the proletariat.
The boys and I talked about those terms a little bit.
Yeah,
they're complex, but you could say maybe we can use even an example. I don't know. Like, I think sometimes the theory of all this gets
Yeah.
complicated. Maybe we can use an example. Like let's use an example of, like, I worked at a company. This is a true story. Okay, I worked at a company where our founder invented a unique device, patented it, and it became very well known and highly desired all over the world. I went to work at that company and contributed a lot of value along the way, but ultimately, like, this was, you know, his idea, and so some would say that this CEO, who is now a billionaire, and me working there, contributing a lot, he was oppressing me, right? Or that I was working and I should control the means of production in this company. But at the same time, like, I would not have had the opportunity to work in this company, and I made a good living, and I got stock options and all this kind of stuff, right? And so, on the other hand, I think I was actually exploiting him because it was his idea that I used to get, like, more wealth in my life. And so, in an example of that, like, I could see somebody coming in subjectively and saying, like, oh, bad guy, billionaire, came up with idea, oppressed all these people, exploited their labor. But from my view, I didn't view it that way. And I was a worker and a contributor in the company. So how does one break that down reasonably?
So
right?
Ultimately, there are two things that I want to discuss here, right? Is that capitalism alienates us from our labor, right? So in terms of viewing wage, right? Or specifically capitalism alienates us from our labor. So that means that we don't really see the value of the labor that we produce, right? Now, depending on your position at the company, you're either more or less alienated from your labor, right? So a guy who is someone who, like, a manager, not a manager, right? But let's say this guy is a CEO, right? And you worked in a position where you're creating the factory, right? Where you're utilizing the tools, you're utilizing all these things to help function this, right? If you're the guy right under him, you wouldn't say that the guy right under him is being exploited, right? Because the guy right under him is making billions and billions of dollars, right? So capitalism always defaults to these hierarchical forms of exploitation or scales of exploitation, and the most exploited people are the ones who produce things, right? Now, one of your arguments here is that, well, you utilize this idea, and it's important to recognize that ideas don't produce wealth, right? They are important, but they don't really produce wealth in terms of actual praxis. They may create forms of producing wealth. So an idea might formulate a method into which you create wealth, but the actual creation of the wealth comes from the labor that is produced, right? So if you're a factory lineman, you're the one actually producing the labor, the value of the.
So if I invent, if I invent something that nobody else has invented, maybe it's a unique alloy, it's super light and super strong, and I invented it, and I give people the recipe, on the line, they come in and I give them the recipe, pour so much of this in, pour so much of that in, and then that puts it out. I guess, like, I'm just trying to understand how that idea is not being exploited by others. Then it's my idea, right? Like this new super alloy, let's say. How am I exploiting the labor of the people that make it?
Yeah, so ideas.
I took the risk. I built the factory. I took the time. I did all the studies. I invented the thing. I came up with the recipe. I took the risk. I invested in the equipment. They're just showing up. They're literally just showing up by their own free will to work for a wage that they can go work somewhere else. So I'm just like, how is that exploited?
So here's the thing: ideas can be exploited. That's something that we need to understand. It's not necessarily the idea that is the thing that's being exploited, because ideas are not concrete in terms of how they produce value, right? So let's say you're a factory. So let's use a real world praxis of this. Let's use a real world analysis of this. You're a guy and you start a car company, right? And this car company produces electric cars, right? And that's your idea. That's your labor, and you bring it up to your boss. That that idea is then stolen by him, claimed by him, and utilized by him. This is exploitation that occurs on all levels. So it's not the idea, but in the same nature, you could also take an idea, begin to start a factory, and then
taking an idea and making it reality are two different things, right?
So so in that nature, it's not the idea that is the point.
I have an idea for time travel. I have an idea for teleportation, but taking it, like making it a reality, like in this case, like actually making the first electric car.
So understand here, it's not the idea that's being exploited. It's the method of which labor functions, right? Or it's the method of how wage labor function that is inherently exploitive in nature, right? And this is one of the key tenets of understanding why the communists believe that communism is necessary, is because whenever there is capitalism, wage slavery occurs, right? Now you guys are like, wait, what is wage slavery? How does that make that probably sounds confusing, right? So I want to give you guys kind of an example, right? And this is one of the things that helped me understand or understood wage slavery. So for capitalism to exist, there needs to be classes. It's impossible for everybody it's impossible for there to be a unification of classes for exist, because it's antithetical to capitalism. Capitalism needs private property, right? Not everybody can get rich under capitalism. It's impossible, right? Historically, it's impossible. Nor do people actually champion this, because for production to occur, you need workers, right? So capitalism.
So not everybody can. Oh, go ahead, Will.
Yeah.
I understand your point, right? Like for maybe back then, like in the 1800s or whatever, where like people maybe couldn't get away from like a special job they worked at, right? Maybe they were a slave or whatever. But nowadays in capitalism, you're able to choose where you get to work. So it's not necessarily wage slavery. You don't, if you think that this one place is treating you wrong, you could just go to a different place and start working there.
So when I say not everybody can get rich under capitalism, I'm not saying everybody.
But nobody gets rich in communism, right?
Yeah.
No. Well, the country.
So not everybody gets rich in capitalism, but nobody gets rich in communism.
The people become, the working class enriches itself, right? Yeah. So
everything,
but not
like
really.
That means like you're not really that rich anymore, because then it's all even out.
And I think this is where the notion of equal outcomes comes to play, where when Will described communism, he said, well, everybody gets the same. And I mean, maybe correct us, but doesn't everybody not get the same? So like, let's say you're a beautiful mind and you work harder than other people in the community, you contribute more, but you get the same, right?
No, you don't get the same.
So I could have a bigger house, I could have a bigger car, I could have more food, I could have things like that in a communist setup.
Yeah, if you build a big house and you build a bigger house than your neighbor, you don't owe that house. See, that's one of the key miscommunications and misunderstanding. The key goal of communism is that the labor that is produced by the working class is owed to the working class. The labor that you produce is owed to the proletariat, the working class, right? So that's why I said, when everybody in capitalism, it's impossible for everybody to get rich. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying that that capitalism doesn't allow for all individuals to produce wealth, or all individuals to work towards producing wealth individually. What I'm saying is that it is impossible in a capitalist country for everybody to be rich, or every single individual in that country to be rich. It needs classes to exist, right?
Yes.
So you guys ask, well, if I build a bigger house, right? That could be owed to you. If you build a bigger house and you're given that labor and you produce that labor yourself, you don't owe that house to anybody else. Communism now, as opposed to communism 2,000 years ago. Right? Let's look at housing right now, right? How many homeless people do you guys know how many homeless people are in America?
I saw the number. It's like 500,000, 600,000?
It's 653,000 people in homelessness. Now, I want you guys to take a guess. Now, I want you guys to, this is one of the key understandings that kind of made me understand more like why communism is necessary. How many houses do you think there are for every homeless person in America.
Oh, at least, yeah, there's definitely space.
Yeah.
There are
Now,
20.
are you counting for, there's people with multiple homes, right?
I'm counting.
Yeah.
I'm talking about vacant homes. So homes that
Vacant
have
homes. Okay.
Yeah, vacant homes. There are 28 houses for every homeless person in America. That means if you were to give every homeless person in America, there would be 27 houses for those individuals left over. So it's like, how does that exist? How does that occur? Well, one
Yeah.
of the things, yeah, and why there is, so that's one of the things that we have to understand is that
I think that's a really good point. That's
Yeah.
a pretty good point.
it's like,
Yeah.
why is homelessness is not an issue that needs to exist.
Yeah.
And you could
Well,
give homeless you could give homelessness you could give a house to every individual, and there would still be a surplus of houses for
Yeah.
that to function. Or there would
Part
there-
of homelessness,
well-
though, is it's more than just that they're homeless. It's also
Yeah.
that they have drug addiction
Yeah.
and mental illness,
Yeah,
right? So
which is one of the issues. But the key tenet here is that you have to understand that when there is a separation, or there is a separation from the labor that you produce, there is an unnecessary, and one of the key things that you also have to understand is that in America, especially now, and in society as a whole, there is an extraneous surplus of value, right? This is why, in case you guys don't know this, a lot of people don't know this, Marx was an economist. He was actually,
Yeah.
this is why people read Marx in college, is because he was an economist. He studied economics. One of the key things that you have to understand is that there's such a huge surplus of value that creates all of these extraneous issues in order to supply and line the pockets of wealth, which is why there are people who are democratic socialists, as opposed to, or people who believe in socialist causes and socialist ideas and things that are rooted, but don't necessarily argue for the dismantling of capitalism, right?
If you're then saying that all the homeless people in America can have a house, why can't, for free, basically, right? Why can't we just get a free house?
Well,
That's not fair.
Well, here's the thing, right? Is that houses are already built, right? I'm not saying that individuals don't need to work, right? Like, this is one of the key misunderstanding. It's like, people don't need to work. Like, if you were to give homeless people a house in America, right? Or you were to give not even just houses, but spaces to live in, right? Which already exist, homeless shelters or things like that. And you were to work on these things, and you were to transform this labor into housing, and you're like, oh, why should I have to work to own a house? In part, you shouldn't have to work as hard as you do to own a house. I mean, currently in society, there's no necessity for this extraneous amount of labor to own a basic house. There's no real need or moral need for people to work.
This is a point I actually really I want to stress, because I agree with that. The value of homes is now almost unattainable for a lot of people in America. I feel fortunate. I grew up in a time where I got out of college, I got a job, and I was able to buy a little condo. And then, I turned that into a house, and I turned that into another house and another house, right? And property values have gone up tremendously, but that is mostly driven, right, by inflation. And inflation is created by debt and a fiat money supply. And a fiat money supply is actually one of Marx's tenets. They need to control the money supply, right?
Yeah.
So in my opinion, we have communism in America. We have a fiat money supply that the people don't manage. The government manages it. They print when they want. They take debt when they want. And so I think there's an argument to say that that idea has actually contributed greatly to inflation, which has made prices of assets go up, and that has exacerbated the wealth divide.
Yeah, so I believe what you're referring to, the fiat money supply, Marx argues that we should that value comes from labor. He doesn't argue that value comes from money or something that is foundational. So one of the key ideas in Marx is not that we should own, or that we should own money, right? But rather that the working class is owed the labor they produce, right? So the working class, the individuals, the people that put in the labor, are owed the labor that they occur. And that's why it goes back into exploitation, right? Exploitation occurs when when the labor that you produce creates surplus value, right? Which we refer to as profit. Now, surplus value is so large and so extraneous in America and in economic conditions that in nature it has to be exploited, right? So if you all the see, I have a job, right?
Who decides what surplus is though?
So surplus value is labor is something that we can actually like track. It's the labor is the extraneous labor that is stolen from the working class, and it doesn't refer to labor or labor. And one of the arguments that someone brought up, he's like, well, what if you need to grow the business? What if you need to grow the those things? It's like, well, that is work, that is growing the means of production, right? That's not the surplus value we're referring to. We're referring to the surplus value that is stolen and put directly into the pockets of the individual that runs the factory. So,
like if we think about it as the owner of a company and the workers in a company, what you're talking about in surplus is how much profit that owner takes in, essentially,
exactly.
right? And you're saying that there's a limit to how much that should be, and like who decides?
Yeah, so the working class should own the means of production, which is what the communists believe, is that there shouldn't be.
So then why would anybody start a business?
Yeah.
Well, in communism, there is no businesses per se, right? There are factories and there are things that function. One of the things
who comes up with those ideas?
People
Why would they come up with them if there's no benefit?
People come up with those ideas. People come up with those ideas in the
I want to invent an electric car so that I can be wealthy. Bring a lot of economic value to a lot of people.
That's the issue is that you wouldn't want to invent in a communist society. In capitalism makes us think that we need to invent things to get wealthy, right? But wealth isn't something that we should derive, or wealth in terms of personal value or fetishizing money is not something that the human or individuals should chase after, right? We should find wealth in other facets of society. And I was actually in a debate about this, actually, the other guy, and he's like, well, and I was and it was about AI, and I had this crazy this theory that we need to utilize AI to minimize labor, and then humans can flourish and dally and read art and literature and do all the other things that are extraneous. And it's like, and he said, well, human dignity needs labor, and I was like, see, that's the thing. It's like that labor does in a sense give us human dignity, but labor that is stolen from us and labor that it needs exploitation doesn't give us liberty. It doesn't produce the value that we give.
I'm still though confused on what's the limit? Like if I own let's just even really simplify it, okay? I own a coffee shop and I make delicious coffee. I came up with a recipe that makes delicious coffee. I got these two guys that work for me in making my coffee, and people love my coffee, so they keep coming in. So then I have to expand, and I make more coffee, and ultimately, it's so popular that we get a lot of people coming in for coffee, and I'm paying these two gentlemen but I'm making a lot of money because it's my coffee shop. I took the risk. I took the thing. I made the recipe. At what point, am I making too much? Is it 10% profit, 20, 50?
See, that's the confusion. It's not about what you're making. It's about the way you're making it, right? It's about the function of how you're taking away wealth, right? So let's say you own that coffee.
Who am I taking wealth from in that though?
Let's say your coffee shop, which is actually a petite bourgeoisie thing. It's not a bourgeoisie thing, right? So it's a smaller bourgeoisie, which
until it turns into Starbucks.
Yeah. So let's say, see, that's the thing, right? It's a petite bourgeoisie thing until Marx writes about the bourgeoisie. So Marx actually writes about, he actually accounts for this. He's like, wow, look, this is the petite bourgeoisie. He says the petite bourgeoisie will ultimately, because there is such a distinction between the labor, they will ultimately blend in with the bourgeoisie. They ultimately become part of the working class, because as a small business owner or as a small restaurant owner, you are ultimately actually putting in risk, right? Yes. When you're a billionaire, risk isn't really a real thing, right? At least not in a real world practice, right? You're a billionaire, you put in $1 million into a company to grow it, you still have a billion left, right? Yeah. So it is understandable that there is a driver or a need or want, right, to derive some wealth from the labor that you're producing, which is what the communists are arguing, right? Is that labor belongs to the working class. Labor belongs to those who produce it, right? But when you have a such a alienation and such a surplus value of labor, there ultimately comes a system of exploitation that occurs, right? So let's look at one of the most foundational things, food, right? Let's look at how food functions in America. What do you guys think the surplus of food is? Like, how much do you guys think that food? How much of food do you guys think is actually unsold or uneaten?
Oh, it's a lot. I've seen this number. It's a lot. Yeah. Actually, like too much food is like one of our biggest problems in America.
Yeah,
right?
A big problem.
It's big.
91 million tons, and that is 38% of our food supply. That is there is such an exacerbated amount of surplus that is derived from that labor, and that is unnecessarily derived because it drives and incentivizes profit, right? Which is one of the issues, is that when you look into creating a business or creating a wealth, you shouldn't look into creating wealth to line your pocket, but wealth in the terms of the capitalist sense, but wealth that benefits not only yourself, that you derive, the labor that you derive from, but wealth that also benefits the community and the working class where it is necessary, right? So let's say you own a coffee, or let's say you work in an agriculture farm, or you work as a farmer, right?
Yeah.
You create these things and you have this, because there's not a majority of Americans, right, are not farmers, right?
Yeah.
Something that is necessary for people to do is work. People need to work, right? People enjoy work, right? Or people enjoy labor specifically.
I don't know.
Here's the thing. People enjoy labor, right? A lot of people are like, well, if you don't have to work, then most people in some way enjoy working. I mean, this is how societies have functioned for life.
I agree, though, that people find usefulness when they are working or providing labor, right? They have purpose, usefulness, and that it provides reward and like a happiness feedback loop. I agree with that in principle, but when I look around society today, I think there's also a desire to maximize your output, maximizing your outcomes versus minimizing your level of effort.
Yeah, see which is why Marx actually talks about this. This is called the alienation of labor. It's that the working class.
But Marxism promotes the exact. So go ahead, and then I'll chime in on this.
So Marx argues that we are so separated from our labor. Individuals are so separated from their labor and the value they actually produce, and we're referring to workers, right? Workers are so separated from their labor that they don't actually get that feedback loop, right? I work at Burger King, right? I go in, I flip burgers, I'm miserable. I go home, I get like $20. I get $20 in my bank account after like 5, and I don't see any of the value that is produced from my labor, or I don't see a while the economic output that is hugely robbed from me or hugely stolen, specifically from my corporation, it lines their pockets, right? Now this is part of the nature of exploitation, right? And part of the nature of how it works is that the working class has been so separated from the value they produce and the actual work that they're outputting that it is so hard for us to actually measure how much value we're actually producing, right?
Yeah, I guess go ahead, Will.
The thing is, though, with those people that are higher up that are getting more money, those people, they've probably worked to be there. So they're probably, the money that they're getting is probably well-deserved.
Well, here's the thing, right? Is that I would argue that there are certain circumstances where individuals do put in effort in order to climb up, right? There are circumstances where people work towards that, right? Where people work to produce value or work to climb higher up in society. And the argument isn't that people don't work towards this. The argument rather is that the climb towards this, or the higher you get up, the more you need to exploit someone or exploit some form of work or some form of the capitalist system in order to climb up. Now here's a real world example of this. Look at a company like Apple, right? Steve, or individuals that work at Apple, or people who are climbing up, they do put in work and they do function into work. However, simply just saying that they work or they work up to it is ignorant of the fact, right, that at the same time that they are working up, or that they are working like to climb up or to get rich in that company, at the same time that that's occurring, they need to utilize slave labor from the Congo to produce their parts, right? So while these individuals are working class, exploitation is still happening, right?
Yeah.
And individuals need to participate in this exploitation in order to climb up, right?
Mhm.
Which is why you need to get the labor that you're producing, right? Which is why you're owed the labor you're producing. So let's say you guys want to work, right? You guys, let's say in a communist society, you guys want to create a coffee shop, right? For whatever reason, you guys want to innovate the coffee shop in order to produce this, right? Now, in a society where your needs are met and you're producing things, it's like you receive the value of the labor you're producing because you actually own the coffee shop rather than just participating in it, or you're part of the coffee shop and you see that labor actually coming to you, right? Which is what is the communists are arguing, is that labor needs to come to you, and it needs to come specifically to the working class, right? We look at the working class as well as a collectedness, right? Which is why we need to understand that communism isn't arguing that everybody gets the same thing, right? It's arguing that everybody's needs need to get done, and that the individual everybody's needs to be met, while the individual needs to or the working class needs to see the value of the labor they're producing.
Well, if your needs are being met, what incentive is there to work hard and innovate and so forth if your needs are being met by the lowest level role in the system? So
I was actually on an anarchist forum the other day, and they were like asking questions, and they were like, well, if nobody needs to work, if what incentivizes you to work? And I commented, what would make me not want to work? I would comment, you'd probably die. Like, realistically, right? It's like it sounds like,
well, not if your needs are met. If your needs are met by the system, because it requires somebody to work somewhere.
Yeah, it requires everybody to work. It requires there is no you are not owed anything by anyone, right? You are not owed a house, or you're not owed things, right? If you're a serial killer, or you're a terrible person, specifically if you're someone who is not actually producing any labor, there's no reason for individuals to feed you, right? Now,
that's interesting. Okay, let's say you don't want to take part in this system. You don't want to have a job. And then what happens to those people?
Yeah, so there's two things. Is that one, eventually people are going to come under the realization or the recognition that most people, it is a very minority, right, that will realize that they need to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like that they need to produce value, or that they want to produce value, right?
Yeah.
Sitting home on your phone all day, doom scrolling, while for a week might seem pleasurable, in the end goal, there is a need in human nature in order to advance, something, or work on something. This is why people innovate outside of that. Or people innovate in terms of working towards this. So let's look at a real world practice application. You look at the USSR, right? People needed to work. People needed to work in the USSR in order for it to function, in order to feed individuals.
They were assigned work.
Well, individuals were already working, and they were moved towards places where they worked, which is revisionism. And in part, I would argue that revisionism under Stalin failed heavily. Like there's
a part of communism where you can be assigned a job. And
I mean,
right?
No, you're not assigned a job in communism. In Stalin,
if you don't want to find your own job, then you're assigned one, right? Or they kill you, or let you die. Like, what happens?
Well, I mean, nobody has to let you die.
Today we have social systems that take care of people that fall through the cracks, right? We have safety nets for these things. And
it's like people could die if society doesn't want to take care of you. But realistically, there would be no need for people to die. There would be no need for people to be lazy or not participating in agriculture.
But they're the same people. That's the same human nature. They're the same people that we have today. They're going to be drug addicts or mentally ill, and what do we do with them? We gotta have programs for them, right?
Yeah. So we can have for drug addicts and homeless people and drug addicts and mentally ill people, we need to have, homeless people, and not everybody needs to work, which is where the phrasing.
So why wouldn't I just want to be one of my needs are met and I don't have to work? When I think of like human nature, right? I want the best outcomes, right? I want to optimize my outcomes in life. And I want to minimize my level of effort to get those outcomes. So if the outcomes are, let's say, fixed, like I can only get to a certain level of outcome, whether it's, wealth or my possessions or property or whatever, in a communist system, it seems like there's a ceiling on the outcomes. So then what it will do is it will drive people to minimize their level of effort, because now I want to have minimal effort for this outcome. And if the outcomes are the same, then effort is going to asymptotically go to zero. And I think this is like one of the real challenges with communism is how do you incentivize people to work hard when it's a theoretical, like, because it's because it's the right thing to do to go invent stuff, and then hand that over to society. But if you don't reap the rewards of that, I don't see how people are really incentivized to do that. And so my view of this, and I think a lot of people that would have criticisms of communism say that it is anti-human nature, it is anti-innovation, and it puts society into a downward spiral of effort.
Yeah, that is I'd say one of the more compelling arguments, and more the foundationally backed arguments in terms of actually understanding or critiquing communism. So let's go into that. First thing, right? This ceiling argument, right? There is in communism, there is a ceiling, right? And it's the ceiling has, I would argue, right, in terms of what Marx is actually arguing is, does the wealth that you have ultimately I'd say there's almost two ceilings, right? And the first one comes before the first one comes after the second
basic
one.
needs, and then
So is the amount of wealth that you derive, and this ceiling, I'd argue, in reality, because there's such a surplus of value, is non-existent, right? It's is the fact that you have so much extraneous wealth while an individual is suffering that's one of the ceilings, right? It's like, and Tupac, not to quote Tupac, but Tupac actually talks.
Okay,
Tupac actually says it's crazy and immoral for a billionaire for someone to have billions of dollars in their pockets, right? Now, here's the thing.
But they don't have it in their pockets. This is like one of the fallacies, I think, of billionaires. It's all in their companies, and people want.
He says specifically, he says millionaires, or for it to have millions. Yeah, but anyways, but he says that, and so here's the thing. That's one of the ceilings. However, this ceiling is ultimately deconstructed because there is such a surplus value of work that I'd argue that the labor output that is produced is nowhere near the labor output that is necessary for human survival, right? So human survival, I'd argue now, if we would just wanted to survive as a society, we can minimize labor lower than 10%. I would argue, right? Because the labor that actually goes into producing basic needs and basic basic things is nowhere in comparison to the actual labor produced, right? Only a minimal amount of labor actually goes into producing value that is necessary for human survival, right? And we can and that tracks with the food surplus, right? It's like there is such an extraneous amount of food surplus because it drives and incentivizes profit, right? So here's the thing, right?
But this has also, it's uplifted, like there's less starving people in America than there were 100 years ago. The global poverty rate is up since the onset of capitalism. The standard of living is up globally, largely because of capitalism and innovation and the Industrial Revolution. And so, I guess like when I look at outcomes, right, from a system, a governance system, capitalism has had. It's not perfect. Don't get me wrong. All of these systems, I think, have similar challenges in terms of they are ripe for corruption, collusion, and so forth. But capitalism has produced incredible outcomes for the globe. communism has provided incredible levels of poverty and death for the globe historically.
Yeah, so
I just don't like understand. Like, I think it's just it's such a hard thing to.
So here's the thing.
How do people still want communism? Tell me.
It's an understanding of praxis, right? Or it's an understanding of
I feel like I have to be some kind of like philosopher to like, this is a utopian idea. Like the I guess the point I'm getting at is like,
these are
the real world.
These
in
are
the real world, it's not it's like it doesn't show that it has feasibility for implementation or any of that.
These are some of the common arguments I encounter every day, which is which is why we need to and as communists we can't just say, well, communism will work or communism
hasn't been done right yet. That's what I hear all the time.
Yeah, we can't just say that. We have to actually be scientific in our socialism. So real communists,
why don't instead of I feel like communists typically, and a lot of our conversation is in this like value production, bourgeoisie, proletariat. It's all like sort of like theoretical talk. Why don't the communist anarchists get together? Because you can be an anarchist and a communist in a capitalist country. I cannot be a capitalist in a communist country. So why don't you guys prove the experiment? Like, why don't you go, find some land and prove this out and see how it can scale and prove it out versus talking about revolution and all of this, because it just seems like that would be a better argument to show people like how it works.
Yeah, here's one example of that actually functioning. Actually, I'll give you 3 examples. The Zapatistas in Mexico are one of the most famous. The Zapatistas and the Bolshevik Revolution, I'm arguing first, are not inherently or specifically tied to anarchists. They just follow almost all or almost or close to all the same principles as anarchism, right? So the Zapatistas and in Mexico, which have provided and helped highlight with some of the autonomous regions in things, and also the Rojava movement in Syria that is occurring. So those are 2 anarchist communes that have occurred, right? Or that are currently occurring, that are functioning right now and battling for Rojava is currently in a battle for independence, and it's one of the most foundational battles that a lot of anarchists talk about. And the Zapatistas are they're just functioning as an autonomous region. So there are functions in which this place has occurred. Now they're also
still in development, right? These are revolutionary conflicts, basically.
Yeah, the Zapatistas are not necessarily in a quote unquote revolutionary battle. They exist as like their own autonomous. The Rojavas are in a battle. Ironically enough, like parts of their autonomous region are like helped a little bit by like the US. Like they are given like some weapons, specifically because because it's militarily beneficial to overthrow, like to like assist in the the Syrian battle. But anyways,
why don't we see more of it in the United States? Like those are interesting. I'm not too familiar with those examples, but why? Like I mean, we have the Amish. I don't think we'd call them maybe communist, but like there are maybe some. Well,
I'd actually argue, like ironically enough, the Amish are specifically in the way they live in communism. They kind of resemble primitive communist societies. They kind of live in that like foundation.
So why don't we see more people going to that then?
Yeah. So here's the thing. It's that labor is that the state of labor right now needs people to work to live, right? It's harder to live in communes like that. It's harder to live in a society or live separate away from a society, even though individuals can do that, and there are individuals that practice in that. It's harder to do that, right? So why doesn't everybody do that? Well, one, companies exist, like capitalism exists in America. It's hard to move away.
How is Nike holding the Amish back from living the way that they want to live?
The Amish live the way the Amish specifically live the way they want to live for religious reasons, and they live without technology. But most people want to utilize technology, right? So the communists,
they want all the benefits of capitalism, but they don't want capital.
So that's why we have to understand what one of the things that a lot of people actually don't understand or don't.
Well, there's a lot of talk by Pablo. I feel like you're telling us that we'd have to understand, like there's a lot of talk about like we have to understand.
Mhm.
What is it that we don't understand?
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? When I talk about this,
I feel like I'm not going to go read 20 books.
I got you.
I've read some Marx, and I'm not like I'm not enlightened. I'm not enlightened. It's it's a fictional novel of theory.
Here's the thing, right? I keep utilizing this word understandingness, right?
Yes.
And actually, kind of. I know we talked about going into gender ideology and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of ties into the word. You know the word woke. That word,
yes.
That is one of the most utilized words that is utilized incorrectly by people. When I say you need to understand this, what I'm referring to is class consciousness, right? Or the beginning of wokeness, right? And it comes from a restructuring of ideology,
class
right?
system.
It comes from I have to step outside of the lens of capitalism, and I have to step from a scientific lens and actually analyze what's going on, right? I have to use academic and historical dialectics. We have to be scientific. Now, a lot of individuals, they're not so well up. It's hard for them to read theory. It takes a lot of time to read theory, right? Which is why we need to understand what's going on a foundational level. And that foundational understanding, and what I keep saying is you need to understand, not to offend you guys, is that I'm coming from a place of class consciousness, right? I'm coming from a place where I was a full-on capitalist. I believed in the libertarian. I was a libertarian, a right-wing libertarian. I viewed as
libertarians and anarchists have some overlap, actually, right? Like small government, limited government, right?
Yeah, anarchists are libertarians. When I say libertarian, I'm referring to the right-wing libertarian. Anarchists are libertarians. In fact, one of the most common names for us is socialist libertarians. Is that unlike libertarians, we realize that the power structures, however, can't just be abolished by reducing the government or reducing the state. We also need to realize that a part of the people that contribute into this are the people who own the seat and the means of production, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Sorry, we kind of went a little bit off topic there.
Yeah, that's okay. I think and I'm not trying to be confrontational. I'm just really trying to understand.
Don't worry about it. I hear.
I know you're a debater. You're used to the same, but like I'm just trying to understand. Like, as you said, I need to understand. So I'm not deeply versed in all of this theory. However, I feel like I have a good grasp on reality and what is feasible and what is not, and history of what has been tried and what has failed and what succeeds. And for those reasons, and this is like the most common criticism that communist ideologies get is like the feasibility. And so every time I try to put let's say pressure test, a real world example, like, hey, I invented something cool. Like, how would this work? I increase the value of my home, like, and I think about like, well, why would I do that? What do I get out of that? And I really try to break down these like real world examples. I circle back to the conclusion that, gosh, there's just, it's a real stretch in terms of like what incentivizes me to want to live in that system.
Yeah. So I would implore you to do, okay. So when it comes to understanding dialectics and history, one of the things that I would implore you and the audience to do is that, and something I actually do when I when I talk about politics with my dad a lot, is that he reads me out a headline. He reads me out something that he heard online, and I'll tell him, okay, let me look it up. And then after I look at a primary source, I look at a secondary source to confirm what I'm seeing. I'll read a source from Fox News or a source from CNN, and then I'll read an actual historical or UN source to understand what is actually going on here. And this is one of the key issues that I think is so prominent in America, is that there is a large amount on all sides, specifically, of misinformation and disinformation, and it is incredibly becoming difficult to actually recognize what's going on. So
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Yeah. So one of the things that, and I implore you, as whether you're a communist or a capitalist or anything, is step outside of your ideological framework. right? Which is something I do whenever I read anything. Whenever I read, especially, I'm an anarchist, and I read a lot of, I've been reading more about Marxist-Leninism, and even though I am antithetical today, I step outside of my framework and I see, and I apply dialectics, right? I apply, how is this actually functioning? How can I analyze this, right? Which is something that we need to analyze, right? And when we look, and when we look how communism itself has actually involved itself and functioned within society and worked towards society, we recognize that it's not necessary, that there is a lot of misrepresentation of information in mainstream understanding of individuals, specific for a variety of reasons, right? So one of the main things is this death toll number, right? And I've gone into research into the death toll, and I'll give you this in contrast to that. The other day I read a post specifically that went into deaths that were caused by capitalist countries or capitalism itself, and the post was referred, and it said 1.69 billion deaths, right? So it's like, whoa, 100 million, 1.69 billion. And now here's the thing, right? I didn't look more in depth into the post, but I read some of the events and I understood how they were actually functioning in terms of things. It's like, whoa, these numbers, it's like we have there's a lot of numbers here. Like, what is going on, right? And it's like, wow, we have to understand. Sorry, I keep saying we have to understand. Yeah. We have to be conscious of what we're reading. We have to be conscious and recognize how different events are actually interacting with systems. Now, real world human psychology, that's a more complex and understanding. And, we can go more into that if you like. But specifically on why would you want to participate in a communist society, right? Yeah. Why would you want to work if you just have to give it away to society? Why do you want to work if you have to, right? And once more, it goes into the surplus value of labor, right? The communist argues that we are alienated from our labor. And the belief is that in communism, you are, specifically in capitalism, we're alienated from our labor, or the value that we see from our labor, right? Yeah. And in communism, you realize the value that this labor is producing more. You see that value going more to benefit you, right? Yeah. That surplus of value is going into you. And the reason that's so hard and complex to understand, specifically even now as a person, I don't have a hard grasp of understanding it, but I'm still reading more and recognizing how large that surplus value actually is. Yeah. Right. That helps us understand is that the surplus of that value is so large. It's so infant. Yeah. I'd argue.
But how do we decide? Like, so I don't disagree that there is a large surplus value. We have a huge wealth inequality in the country. And there are people that have a lot, right? And then there are people that are struggling and don't have much. And so there's no argument that exists. I believe it's a different cause than maybe capitalism. I think it's actually communist influence on our money supply and our systems that have contributed to it versus capitalism and free markets. Inflation primarily is what I think has caused the wealth gap over time. And that's driven by money supply.
Yeah, and here's what I had to ask you, right? It's who influenced inflation? Who? Yeah. Who are the primary people who influence? Who is the people who regulate these things? And it's like, this is why we have to be critical.
The government.
Of these things. Yeah, the government, and not only that, corporations also drive and participate in part of the reasons that inflation has existed, right? So. It's
also like, but you got, there's philosophers that the communist community enjoys, like Keynes. He promotes fiat money systems. He wants inflation in these systems. And I think it's like largely because he wants to implode capitalism. Like, I can't find another reason why an economist would say that.
So here's the thing: the communists don't agree with Keynes. Actually, the communists don't agree with the democratic socialist. Right? We view it as a not just a band-aid solution, but an impractical one in nature. Right? Let's look at something like minimum wage. Right? I was actually reading into this for the debate yesterday, and it's like the issue of minimum wage could inherently, or raising minimum wage could inherently damage the working class by creating creating a higher inflation rate. And there are some, and this can be reduced in certain measures and certain practices, but we're not arguing for government regulation. We're arguing that surplus value needs to begin to go towards the labor, not just through taxes or through a monetary system, but actually go towards the working class.
So without an authority in charge, I still struggle with, like, there is surplus. No disputing that. Okay, there's surplus in the system. Who decides how much, to whom, from whom?
The working
in terms
class.
Of surplus?
So here's so there's two things, right? There's two things that you said there, and I want to bring this up, and it kind of goes into my dual identity, right? As an anarchist and a communist, right? It's like okay. I'm both. So who decides what, right? Now, Marxist-Leninists believe that there needs to be this word, which is one of the most confused words of all time, a dictatorship of the proletariat, which refers to when the proletariat takes control of and seizes the means of production. It's when the working class begins to be part of the working class. Becomes the primary political superior party, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily a literal dictatorship. That's not what Marx is talking about, right?
Yeah.
So he's talking.
But it's so. We have people with these ideas. They come into a lot of our chat threads and stuff too, and like people have deemed, Elon has too much money. Well, okay, maybe Elon does, but who doesn't? Like, at what point is it like, well, that person's okay, or that person didn't exploit labor? It seems like there's a real subjective level of the people who decide, right? It's this almost like this democratic process by the laborers on who decides if this person has been exploitive or not.
Yeah.
And I just think that's like really scary, because what if you create a company in good faith and good interest, and it grows, and you do well as part of it because whether the stock or the valuation grows, and then now people want to end your life because you've been successful. Like, that's weird. That is really weird that like people want to kill Elon because he's too rich.
Mm-hmm.
Or somebody like him, like a CEO, like a Luigi. Like, that is wild that people would think that way.
So I had to say two things on that. One, when does that end, right? When does that begin, right?
Yeah, what's the threshold? It's a subjective threshold.
So people who actually practice and believe in communism, it's like exploitation occurs on minor scales, right? But this doesn't mean that we kill all these individuals in the communist revolution or overthrow these people, right? There are deaths that
landlords.
Huh?
I'm sorry, landlords.
Yeah. There are deaths that occur because those landlords were feudal. They were feudal. There are deaths that do occur, right? So when does that stop? And it comes into when do you become an exploiter, and when do you become and when are you?
I want to know if I'm an exploiter.
Yeah. When are you part of the proletariat? And actually, one of the reasons I actually came onto your podcast or your guys's, and one of the reasons I wanted to discuss is that the liberals have left us. Like they're gone. Okay. I don't know where they're at. They're waving. They're putting their signs up. Their signs up. They're not doing anything, right?
Yeah.
And I said this, and I say this, and I say the conservative class is easier to convert to communism than the liberals ever will be, right? Because the ideas of because the ideas of the conservative in nature or in desire are actually more bound or closer to the ideas of the communist, right?
Yes.
Because one of the key tenets that the conservative believes on a foundational level is that the laborer or the people who put in their work deserve the output of their work. Similarly, communists recognize the people who put in the work deserve the value of their work. However, what the communist evaluates is that value actually going to the working class? Is it going to the worker and the individual? Which is what the communist wants to analyze, right? Which is what he's studying. He wants to recognize a methodology and formulate a method of analysis to actually recognize this, right? And it goes to without saying that a lot of individuals actually, believe this, but they're ostracized, or they're moved away from ideas like this, or they're moved away from realization, because in large part, a lot of conservatives come from where? They come from blue collar backgrounds, right? In large part, they are put in situations where they suffer extremes, and then instead of and one of the things that they'll do is that they'll blame the rest of the working class rather than blaming the government or blaming the CEOs that are inherently exploiting them, right? We are taught from individuals and in a society, and this isn't to say you necessarily, or in society as a whole, to almost disrespect other workers, right? Where the culture war comes in, it's easier for us to hate each other than to hate the things that are holding us back, right? That's actually why the communists argue that class derives, or that race actually comes from class. All of these hierarchies, they come from class. They don't exist without class. They don't have the power they do on the level they do now without class occurring, right? So this goes more into the Luigi and Elon thing, right? When is killing revolutionary? When is murder susceptible, right? And you look at, let's take the healthcare CEO. He's a more concrete example, right?
Yeah.
You look at the taking of the life, right? And of the healthcare CEO, and you think about it, and on a personal level, it hurts, right?
Yeah.
It's
horrible. This guy's got a family.
On a personal level, it's hurtful, right? And it might, and not to shock you guys, but on a real level, it's necessary, right? And here's why, right?
They went after the wrong guy. They went after the wrong. He's working within the system. They got to go after the system. If they don't like what United Healthcare does, United Healthcare is operating on a system based on Obamacare rules and regulations. What I hear about is trying to kill CEOs that are operating within this regulatory structure of the system. This guy's not breaking any rules. This idea of revolution to bring in a new governance structure, it calls for the ending of a lot of successful people. And I can't help but think, like, if we don't have an Elon Musk in our society, we don't have satellites in space. He puts 80 to 90% of all the satellites in space, his company, EVs, right? Boring companies. He's got he bought America free speech back. If you don't have the brightest and most innovative minds in society, and I hear the complaints that, like, oh, he didn't do it. Well, he brought it to reality, okay? And so I appreciate people that can bring things to reality, whether it's Elon or Steve Jobs or Bezos or whatever. And yes, they're super wealthy, but like, if you take away the most brightest minds of society, like, what's that going to do to society?
Yeah,
you know, these countries that kill off their best, brightest, and smartest and most innovative, they don't tend to do so well.
Yeah, so I would argue that, Elon, in my opinion, is not the smartest and brightest, just based on a few of the things he said. And if he is, and I'd argue that intelligence is a nuanced thing, right?
Well, it's not always intelligence. Sometimes intelligence is, there's EQ, there's IQ, right?
Yeah,
but he's brought things together and produced it. Elon's probably a whole topic in itself, but like, you have to appreciate that people actually brought something from idea into fruition, which he's done. And so he may not be the smartest guy, but he got it done.
So here's how I would evaluate, CEO killing. Just to go into that, it's two things, right? It's why was the shooting that Luigi Mangione did? Why would I argue that it wasn't morally incorrect? I would argue that the amount of deaths that occurred, right, under the healthcare CEO, through denying healthcare claims, through he
denied them within the construct of the system that exists.
Right, and
he didn't go and say, like, I want that lady dead.
Yeah, well, he didn't have to deny them. Like, he doesn't. He's a private healthcare company. He doesn't have to deny these individuals. The system itself is harmful, but at the end of the day, systems don't run themselves. You know what I mean? So it's like people are actively leaders of systems and actively participants in systems, as well as directors of systems. At the end of the day, Hitler fascism was the systemic issue that occurred in Germany, but Hitler was the leader and he had to go too. You know what I mean? When does and it gets to a point where I was actually, one of my friends, he's he's educating himself on these things, and he's understanding it more. He was having a trouble grasping of it, and the reality of the situation, and what a lot of people don't want to accept, is that there is no revolution that isn't violent. You know, there
Yeah.
isn't a revolution.
Well, like, yeah, I mean, Emma Goldman called for a lot of violence. And so, like, I'm curious then, like, maybe this is a good segue into how, from an anarchist communist view, like, how do you get America to shift that way? What are the steps that have to happen?
So there are different viewpoints on this specifically. My view specifically is that revolution will only come when the masses become educated. The revolution is two things, right? I'd argue that the revolution is mutual aid, which is working towards, as a community, to provide your community for things and to provide your community things. And these networks are being set up. So if you guys, to advertise, I would tell people, go out, join a Food Not Bombs center, actually, put your ideas in practice and go work out. So there are two things, right? Is that the revolution is feeding individuals and feeding things, and it is also education, right? So it needs to come from when people become educated.
It sounds like indoctrination, not education, that you're describing, though. We want to educate them on the way that you want them to think, right?
I don't think it's necessarily indoctrination. I wouldn't argue that helping someone realize that they might be being exploited is necessarily indoctrination. I'd argue that any teaching any individual an idea would be indoctrination, right? Like, would you say that you're indoctrinating your kids by bringing them on this podcast and helping them,
Well, we get accused of indoctrination like literally all day, every day.
Well,
So I feel this is.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Max.
So,
Well, the thing is, with every single parent indoctrinates their kids.
mm-hmm. So yeah, here's the thing, right? I'd argue that indoctrination is a very subjective term, right? And if
Yes.
you want to apply it, in that situation, or apply it in a situation where individuals are learning things on their own level, I wouldn't argue that that's indoctrination. Like, take Fred Hampton, for example. He led the once more going back to him, he was feeding individuals while he was also teaching them about socialism. He was providing all these free programs, and he wasn't just putting a spoon in their mouth and a book in their hand. He was showing them and highlighting the methods that were occurring in the real world examples of how this was occurring, and giving actual historics and analysis of this, right? So it's not necessarily indoctrination, in my opinion. Indoctrination,
well, it can be. He's using food as a tool to get their window of opportunity in time to tell them things that he wants them to believe. That's
Fred Hampton. He wasn't using the food as the things, right? The Rainbow Coalition was a
Would
variety.
they have come in otherwise?
Huh?
Would they have come in to talk to him if not for the food?
Individuals came to Black Panther parties, without being fed. Yeah, specifically the Black Panther Party was not, the Rainbow Coalition was a joining of different things, and that also established a mutual aid network. But individuals had joined the Black Panther Party way before that, and it still exists today. So individuals did come for other reasons outside of mutual aid. That was just something that he helped, and individuals didn't even have to necessarily be educated. He put spoons in the mouth of individuals that didn't agree with his cause, which is why I say that the revolution is mutual aid, because feeding individuals comes before, or combating a system has to come from within. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it can't just be non-existent. And the revolution
back to what are the steps? Like, what would the steps be?
I'd argue that classes need to become conscious.
But these are not that's not real. Like, how do I say this? Like, I don't feel like I'm trying to what does that even what does that mean? That's a step. When I think of a step, it's like, okay, we need a large, maybe what you're saying, and I'll try to put this into my terms, because I'm not as versed on all of these Marxist terms. Okay, so what I think you're saying is we need enough volume of people that agree with us that we can start a revolution.
Well, here's the thing. It doesn't necessarily, revolution doesn't have to be transitionary in terms of a war, right?
Okay.
Revolution could just be transitionary in terms of education, right? One of the things that you have to understand is that in terms of proletariat to bourgeoisie, in terms of exploitee to exploited, there are a million of us compared to the 1% that exploits us, right? So there are two things. It's a public realization, and here's the thing, right? Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of things I can do for the communist revolution. And one of the things is educate individuals and participate in mutual aid, right? Participate in actual practice, feed people, help people go out on these things. And that is what I think that the average person should do for revolution, right? Is to participate in these systems, is actually take your ideas and put them into practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that, you know, and the anarcho-nihilist, actually, there's this famous anarcho-nihilist author, his name is Sarah. He says the belief of the anarchist, I'm going to censor it here just to be more clean, but he says
Sure.
the anarcho-nihilist position is essentially that we are screwed, that there is no path but pure negation, right?
Yeah.
So it's the only thing that you can participate in a revolution, or the only thing that you can do is try to advance that, right? The only way I see revolution occurring or revolution happening is when the masses begin to become educated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if there is a transitionary war that is necessary, I would argue that if there's a transitionary war, that transitionary war needs to be on the basis of fighting real world oppression, right? Get rid of the billionaires, because eventually the millionaires will dissolve as long as the billionaires go away, right? It's like the gap between a billion and a million is so high. You know what I mean? It's such an exasperating amount of number.
Why don't you just negotiate with them to confiscate their wealth? Like, is that another, instead of, killing people? Like,
yeah, I mean,
why not just confiscate their wealth?
Yeah, so yeah, you can confiscate their wealth, but the reality of the situation is that slave masters, cling to their plantations, so eventually it does become morally imperative, especially when deaths are occurring. When you look at the CEO killing, it doesn't necessarily peg me as a moral to do something or to do an act that could potentially save lives. And right after, and one of the things I actually tracked right after is I wanted to see real world change, right, from the Luigi Mangione thing, right? And two things I saw was a cultural shift. People began to understand more what's going on with Luigi and what's going on with how healthcare interacts, right? And something I saw is that healthcare companies began to shift their policy. Blue Shield specifically, I believe they're called, actually shifted their very vastly, or they shifted back like literally a week after their unpopular policy on limiting the amount of time that anesthesia would be covered, right? They only had a certain period of time which anesthesia would be covered, right? So it's like these real world changes.
Is that a correlation or a causation, though, do you think?
I would argue that this is,
they're changing policies all the time.
I'd argue that specifically was causational, because the policy for the longest time was there was no sign of it changing, right? There was no real sign of that occurring. And on a more practical level, I'd argue that on a more cultural level, I'd argue that that death specifically helped individuals realize more how the system was exploiting it. There's this quote I read the other day, and it's that good and evil are not Marxist concepts. They're metaphysical concepts, right? They're and this is more of a philosophical thing. They're more of something that we interpret based on observations of the world, right? Yeah. And how I personally interpret it is the death of this person the only time a death, in my opinion, is necessary? Because I am a specifically a Christian, although I am very anti-death, is this death necessary for self-defense, right? Could this be argued that this is in nature some way self-defense, right? And I would argue
that's a stretch.
Yeah, I would argue that it is self-defense. It's self-defense of the working class, right? It's self-defense of the individuals that die under the healthcare system.
This is like cut off one head of the snake and there's 20 others right behind. He's actually not, the CEO of United Healthcare wasn't making any of the decisions on claims, right?
Yeah,
like
but the thing is...
He works within a construct of a system, and his employees work and they abide by the rules and regulations within the thing to maximize profit and so forth, sure, but like to say that like killing him saved lives is a really big stretch, don't you think?
Here's the thing, right? Here's the thing is that it's that the overall change, right, or the overall progression of revolution and the overall movement towards revolution is that it needs cultural change. It needs a methodology to exist, right? Yeah. So let's look at someone like Elon, right? And I was actually thinking about this the other day. Well, if we get rid of Elon, then Trump puts the next big billionaire right up next to him. He puts Bezos right next to him. He puts Mark Zuckerberg right next to him. He puts whoever, right?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I don't think he
no,
puts
thank
any
you.
of them.
He would
Like
not
Elon
put-
is
no.
specifically unique in terms of his ability to
Right,
like, cut
and
waste.
let me be clear. Let me be clear. What I say with this, right, is that replacing one billionaire with another evil billionaire doesn't.
They're
really,
not all evil.
They're
Why
not
would they? Why would
evil.
they be evil?
Why would they be evil?
I think that the accumulation of wealth and the necessary.
What about the hundreds of thousands of jobs they've created?
Okay, look at Zuckerberg.
Giving people,
yeah
an income, a livelihood.
Let's look
But
at someone like Zuckerberg. You know what I
Sure.
learned about Zuckerberg the other day? Zuckerberg was part of a genocide. Zuckerberg's Facebook policy participated and exacerbated the genocide of. Hold on, let me pull up the group of people.
Well,
Dad.
I'm not a huge Zuckerberg fan, but like I know,
Yeah,
boys.
it's
I know
like-
we're
it's
really
like-
long.
it's like-
I'm finding
it's
this
like-
interesting.
It's
If
like
you
we
guys
look
want to
at
take a
these-
break,
I mean, I'd argue that the level of damage that they've created, or the level of what is a positive output that they've created, is not necessarily tied to who they are as individuals. Like Elon Musk creating jobs, it's only exists because he needs to exploit workers, or he needs to exploit more workers, right?
like,
and
so,
that-
like, why would anybody want to start a company in this framework? Like, if I start a
Because
company, and I'm
that's how you
successful, you're gonna
generate.
kill
That's
me?
how you generate.
Like, that's crazy.
That's how you generate wealth. I mean, look.
I don't want to start a company because I'm gonna be like hung, drawn, and quartered. Like, because I'm exploiting people.
That's how you generate wealth.
The more successful I am, the more likely I am to be murdered.
You listen. You generate. Listen. The here's the reality. Okay. So let's go into two things. Like, one, that's not a true statement at all. The more successful you are, the more
I don't hear anybody talking about there. I guarantee you, there are small
people
business
die.
owners
Poor
that
people-
are worse to their employees than Elon Musk is to him.
poor people are killed on the street like every day. You know what I mean? It's like you're not more likely to get murdered because you're rich.
In a communist or anarchist revolution, you would be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, because you're
killing the best and brightest among society. It's a wild premise.
I'd argue the best and brightest are generally the ones who are usually getting exploited. I'd argue the best, and this is one of the things that actually drew me into science and anarchism. Right? I was like, I came into understanding communism and understanding anarchism from a place and position where I was once more a libertarian, and I was also a scientist, and I was and I read these things, right, and I read about, and I wanted to understand. I was like, well, how am I supposed to function if capitalism doesn't exist? And it kind of drew me out, and I was like, what specific part of capitalism, or what specific part of capitalism as a policy, as a state, it drives science to be studied, drives science to be educated, right? Because you look at something like the USSR, right? Let's look at the USSR. You look at, which wasn't a communist society, right? Or a communist country, right? It was a transitionary country, which was transitioning from capitalism to socialism. However, in terms of what they actually were achieving was communist, right? What they were going to do, their praxis was communist, right? Let's look at the USSR. They built and innovated and began to, start space programs. They were the first people in space. So it's not that innovation is necessarily driven by a system, right? Innovation is driven by the working class. It's driven by people who want to do things, right? So I think that is the biggest.
Which system has provided more impactful products to the world, the USSR or America?
I would argue that I'll bite the bullet here. I'm going to say the U.S. specifically because the U.S. has existed for a longer. I don't think that's a necessarily, that's a nuanced enough argument to argue that just because there has been a certain level of production under capitalism, because capitalism has existed for other years, right? It's like, why don't we try other? I think that the reason that there is a necessity, and one of the questions you asked me is like, why are you coming to communism and anarchism, is that the reason that there is a necessity for radicalism and change is that people are recognizing that they don't need to succumb to systems, that they don't need to accept these outputs, that they don't need to.
And what if I don't accept a communist system? What happens?
Okay,
to me?
so yeah, one of the things is that you don't. So I saw that question there, and that was one of the questions that more confused me, and it was more. What if you don't accept the communist society, right?
Yeah.
And
Like what if, like, let's say, like, even let's, like, if I really make it basic, like I'm in a small town and we're all farmers or whatever, and I just have a better garden and I produce more out of my garden because I work hard on it and everything else. And then people say, well, you got to share all of your garden with everybody else. And I'm like, well, no, I don't want to. Then
so
I get taken care of, right?
So this is more the individualist, right? This is more of like the what the anarcho-individualist argue is that individualism is necessary. Now, I personally am diametrically opposed to the individualist, right? I don't believe that societies can function on an individual level because I think it's unrealistic, right? It's that people produce certain things and that people and other people produce different things that they are good at producing. So you look at something like your labor or your wealth, and it's like there is no necessity for that wealth to be stolen if you're producing it. There's that because that labor is yours. That labor cannot be stolen from you, right? What the anarchists or what the communists are arguing that should be taken away or should be moved away is that surplus.
Taken, not moved, taken.
Taken and redistributed to
redistributed, yes,
who actually produce that value, right? Is the means of production, is the ownership, right? So if you're a farmer, that's different from you being a plantation owner, right? That's different from you owning a plantation that you build, right? Now, this is a more extreme example, of course, but owning a plantation or building a plantation that you or owning a plantation in which your slaves work, right, is different from you being a farmer. You're actually producing the work. You're actually getting back the labor that you receive, right? So that labor isn't necessarily stolen from you, right? But
what if I'm a day how about like, so what you're saying is, and I'm sorry, I just like, I will put this into like my terms just so I understand. If I'm using my labor to give myself specific benefits, I get to keep that labor.
Yeah, if it's for you,
like my garden produces 10 times as much as anybody else's garden in my community, and I get to keep that because it's my garden and I tend to it.
If you hold in your hand that shovel and you hold in your things, now there might be, now realistically, this is how it actually applies, right? This is how historically it would apply. Now, if in the most extreme examples, looking at psychological or looking at very, very, very early stages of development in countries, you would not always see this, right? There has to be a human psychological analysis, right? If people are starving, eventually what might occur is that some people might climb onto your farm and steal it, right?
Yeah.
But this is on a very minute, like very, very, like it would have to be an exacerbate amount.
If my garden is so good, I'm producing a surplus, even though I'm the only one with a shovel, but I just work really hard at it. I've perfected my craft. I'm producing more food than I need. So I'm canning it, and I'm freezing it, and I'm doing other things just, in case I have a down season next time around. Do others have the right to come and take my labor or my food in that situation?
I would argue that the labor you owe, right, or that there is that you do owe labor in some faction to society, right? However, here's the thing.
So I don't get to keep. So like,
wait. Here's the thing, right? You have the food, right? You make the food, right? But then Nettie next door, she makes sweaters, right?
Yeah. So a free market, we can trade.
You can trade, yeah, but you could trade in a communist society. This is one of the confusions, is that communism isn't just about like dismantling any form of economy or any form of these things. That's not real practice. Communism is about the owners, the working class owning the labor that they produce, right? So if you're in a farm, right? Now let's look at a realistic example. You're probably not going to work that farm yourself. You might build a garden yourself, but working that farm yourself, if you have a farm and then everybody contributes and everybody produces value, and there is a minimal amount, there is a lessening of the work effort that is produced in order for everybody to survive, and then you guys go and you're like, okay guys, I produce food. Everybody contributes in some way to society, right? Everybody assists in contributing to society. Now, if you're lazy or if you don't want to do that, it's like most people aren't gonna be like that. Most people aren't like that, and that tracks with fact that there's two things, right? Is that most people,
you don't understand human nature, right?
Yeah, most people historically don't want to be, and most people historically and here's the thing, right? Would you argue that even in primitive societies where not every individual worked and participated in an agriculture, and some people like participated and worked in other things and produced art or other things, would you argue, look at the Greeks, right?
They had to survive. They did it to survive. Like, it's different in today's society. They did it to survive.
Yeah, which is another thing. It's like if you want to survive in a real world application, eventually you're gonna have to produce or work in some.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, the thing is, even with going back to like the laziness and all that, who wants to work? You know, like Greeks and back then, and with their Roman emperors and stuff. Why would they? Like, this is just laziness. Why would they then get a general when they could, like, go out themselves? But they need to hire these people for all these jobs that they need to do, so then they can just sit on their throne eating grapes while everyone does their job for them.
See, that's a real that's an exploitation example, I think.
Yeah, so that's a method of how, I'm sorry, I didn't really get the question, but, like, that's a method of how exploitation occurs. A quote my friend said a long time ago is that most people are actually communist. They just haven't gotten the chance to realize it, or they haven't gotten the chance to understand what that actually means, right? And part of the reason that is that we are so propagandized, and we are so in place of a system. And even me, as a person with parents who are Cuban immigrants, was educated from birth in a way that I had to part of the reason, and I actually got into an argument about this one day, is that I have always been a facts first guy, right? Facts first. Facts have to come first. And
why are we talking theory then? Well, like, why don't we talk facts about how this is like actually performed in history?
Yeah. So yeah, we can. That is one of the things that I want to go back into.
I have to ask this. So you mentioned like people worked in more communal societies because they had to, because if they didn't, they would die of starvation or something, right?
Yeah.
A long time ago. Today, that's not really the case. And so if somebody doesn't want to contribute, like, I don't want to contribute to the system, like, I'm not going to do it. Then what? I get taken away? I get put underground?
Yeah, so this is specifically from the anarchist view, right? Which is why, I'm referring to my view specifically. It's that the generally accepted, or the general consensus, is that there's no reason for society to help you if you don't want to produce any labor, right? In real world applications, there are individuals that will still feed you, right? There are still people who, despite you not working, may want to feed you. However, society as a whole might not want to feed you, and that is a realization of what occurs, right? Is that laziness is not a trait, right? Now there are some more futuristic applications of this, and there's more futuristic analysis of this, that eventually in the future there will be a less need for labor, and there'll be an increase in not laziness, but rather labor that is innovative or assistant, or it assists in some nature, right? But at the end of the day, the reality of the situation is that eventually people will need to work to survive, right? Society as a whole will need to work to survive. But the issue isn't how will people work, or when will people work, but rather what the issue we're tackling is how will people see the value of that work come to them? How will the working class grow richer? How will the working class, continue to grow? Okay, and in terms of real world analysis, we can actually go more in depth into that and understanding of that. Yeah.
I do have a lot of people that come into our comments and our threads, and I'm finding that there is this, like, Gen Z is getting more and more interested in communism. You're an example of this. You're a very, by the way, a very well-read and polite and really great example. We've enjoyed getting to know you. There is this, like, contingent of Gen Z that's growing in their interest of communism. And so what I wonder about a little bit is me, like, let's personalize it with me. I I didn't grow up wealthy. I grew up in a very like moderate to lower income family. I saw my dad work hard. He owned a business and it grew largely on his own labor. Okay. He had a few employees. But then I went to school, I came out, I worked, and I saved my money. I went through all these steps, right? Like I had to delay my gratification of buying, a bigger house, having a nicer car. And I worked my butt off for 30 years, okay? And now I'm in a situation where I'm in a good financial situation. The view of an anarchist or a communist, it's like I'm not due what I've made, or this is what I feel like I hear from people. Meanwhile, like now, like you and I, and no offense to you, but like you and I've put in 30 years of labor, okay, to have and be where I am. And you are 17, and I'm sure you're going to be super successful, but you and I would get like, we basically like level the playing field, and you and I are at the same starting position again if anarchism and communism takes hold in America. That seems incredibly unfair to me. How do you rationalize that?
So here's two things, right? It's one thing I had to say to you is that you and I are closer in terms of wealth and in terms of labor than Elon Musk by centuries, right?
Yes, 100%. Yes.
So
He's exponentially further
so
up there.
You specifically, you as an individual, you are which is why it goes back into my other point, is that the conservative class is way easier to convert.
But people, I literally have people say, you live in a nice house. We can tell by, the background of your like videos, and you've exploited, you're a terrible person.
Well,
and I'm like,
Well, I'd argue that these people are not well read, and they're distractionary from
But they want to take my wealth, Pablo.
They're
and they think they're entitled to my wealth.
They're distractionary, and I can't speak for every individual that says that, but I'd argue that a majority of consensus would take years to even come close to touching your wealth, when it comes to actual revolution, because the exacerbated amount of wealth is in the pockets of the 1%, and you and I are not even close to those individuals, right? And that's the issue, right? Is that in the growth of our labor, in the growth of the value that we are receiving from our labor, the larger we grow, the harder it becomes to understand the issue that is occurring, right? So I'll take my father as an example. My father is a carpenter, right? My father, in the same breath as he'll say, damn, this wealthy person, or this person that is wealthy, just stole some money from me. In the same breath, he'll venerate and enjoy the wealth. And it's not, or enjoy the wealthy, right? He'll be like, the wealthy, they run the world. So
but don't you resent, like if I have a nice car, let's say I have a really nice new car, don't you kind of resent those people?
I don't resent those people at all. I resent individuals, and that's the thing, right? Is that there is a growing issue in terms of understanding. What I resent is an attachment to exploitation, right? So I don't resent someone who works hard and owns a nice car, right? There are certainly, like, let's look at a famous political streamer, Hasanabi, right? He is a person who has accumulated a lot of wealth through streaming, right? He's a part of the Petite Bourgeoisie, I'd argue, right? Like he does work that is not necessarily exploitive in nature. He doesn't own he doesn't own factories and stuff.
That's a great example. Yeah.
So he actually he gains the produce, right? But he also recognizes and has the ability to say, well, guess what? Like, that wealth, that he doesn't keep that wealth, he distributes it amongst the working class, right? We need to become more accepting of working class individuals, right? People who are not exploiting. And I think that is a key issue that is difficult in terms of actually getting people on board with our ideas, right? It's like, we need to realize that we need to stop this veneration and this admiration of politicians and these people who are doing these things. We need to stop treating them like gods, and we need to realize their role in society and how they, oppress us, whether it be Joe Biden or whether it be Donald Trump, right? And that's the issue, is that anarchists specifically don't believe there is a two-party system. We believe that in nature, what they actually function to do is work towards helping each other, right? You look at
I actually
someone
agree
like,
with this. I actually agree. It's not a two-party. It's a uniparty system that is built
in the
to
same in
protect
this,
themselves.
and here's the thing, right? Is that you look at someone like Nancy Pelosi, and then you look at someone like Trump. Trump is diametrically opposed to Nancy Pelosi, and then Nancy Pelosi invests in the stock market, which Trump influences through exacerbating war or exacerbating anything else. And even though Nancy Pelosi claims to be diametrically opposed to him, the money that she invests in whatever stock market that is inherently controlled by it benefits her, right? It benefits her more to almost create an illusion of a battle between the political parties, right? To benefit her, right? And that's the issue, right? Is that that's the issue with, I'd argue that's the issue with things like Doge, right? In concept, Doge is necessary, right? But the thing is, or Doge is in concept, right? But this is
the idea of Doge is necessary. I think I think both sides agree that, but like
in concept, Doge is necessary in terms of the fact that governments need to be reduced, right? However, in real world praxis, the richest man in the world,
maybe people can argue that he's making money on Doge, but he seems to be, for a lot of us, good-spirited in terms of his desire to limit government waste because it's good for everyone.
And I'd argue that in part it's not even necessarily his spirit. I'd argue that it's more of a misunderstanding of actually what's going on. So one of the key tenets here that is that we need to understand, right, is that the budget last year was audited in the same way it was audited by independent investigators over 60 times, right? And the only budget, which is kind of hilarious to me, not hilarious in almost a sick and twisted way, the only budget that has failed an audit 7 times is the U.S. military budget, which is our highest budget, right? So I look at something like Doge and I'm like, okay, I believe in reducing military spending, but I don't believe in reducing it for no reason. I believe in reducing it to put it into programs that will actually benefit us, right? And you look at something like the military budget. It's like we spend an exacerbated amount on the military budget. Let's take an issue like food, world hunger. According to UN estimates, to tackle world hunger, we would need to spend $40 billion each year, right? This is as a collective, as a society, we would need to spend $40 billion to tackle world hunger, which is such a difference in value in terms of the military budget, right? So it's like, why aren't we cutting these programs? Why are we cutting the $1 million that we're sending to Libya, which is there for whatever reason, right? Why is that occurring? How is that beneficial, right? Why? Well, and I think the real world.
I mean, there's a lot of erroneous stuff happening with government spending, as you probably know. Like a lot of it is like laundering, it's bribes, it's all kinds of stuff. I don't think anybody can dispute that. Like the money could be spent on better things, solving world hunger, homelessness in America, taking care of our veterans. Like there's a lot of things. Like. So I don't disagree with any of that.
And that's the issue. That's the issue, right? Is that.
But you have to start with cutting the junk, and they've identified over $110 billion in junk.
Okay, so here's the thing, right? It's that the junk that is being cut, we have to understand that the things that are we're referring to as junk is a little more complex than that, right?
As an anarchist, you want limited government. Why not just cut? Like, when in doubt, I have this theory. Actually, you might enjoy this. So I was often thought of as a fixer, okay? I would go around my company, somebody would F up their department, I would go in and fix it, right? Because it got like over bloated or whatever. And so I would go in and I'd say, okay, let's look at our processes and procedures. It's very similar, like theoretically, to government. You start getting layers and layers of processes because over time you just create more. You never take stuff out, right? And so I would go in, I'd rewrite their processes, I'd relook at the staff, and we'd go through. And my philosophy was usually, when in doubt, throw it out. We can always add it back in later. If we're too careful, we won't cut deep enough. And I think we're just cutting the epidermal layer. We haven't even got into the fat or the visceral fat or we're so far from the organs on our spending that I'm not even concerned. Like, we have so much fat in the government that we should be cutting deeper. I want to see them go deeper, deeper, deeper. And I agree that we should be looking into the military budget. I used to work in a business that supplied military gear, and I know what we charged for it. It's crazy. So there's a lot of opportunity. But
and here's the thing, right? Is that I don't necessarily disagree that there needs to be a cut. Well, as an anarchist, I believe that there needs to be an entire dismantling, right? But as a person,
so why wouldn't you be a proponent for like Doge going deeper?
Language is dangerous. Language is so dangerous, and it's not that we should necessarily censorship, but we need to combat the danger that occurs in terms of some of the language.
Yeah, who decides that?
Yeah, with academia, right? With
academia is loaded with people of a specific ideology, though, right?
Academia is, I would argue that the reason that people cling to a certain ideology is because the ideology is based on scientific analysis. I mean, the reason that conservatives fail or like, I saw a clip the other day, and it's like, there's these conservatives that were like, oh, I struggle because I had to be liberal or whatever, right? It's like, dude, no, you struggle because your economics professor gave you a piece of Marx to read, and you like refuse to read it, like, you know what I mean? So it's like it's not.
Well, that's one thing, but what I also see is that students get graded on their interpretation of Marx, and people have different interpretations.
Yeah,
like, I have probably a different interpretation of it than you do.
There are interpretations that are foundationally based, and there are interpretations that are not foundationally based. So let's look at LGBT and or DEI or critical race theory, right? It's like the main critique of DEI is that diversity, and a lot of the things is, and one of the key issues is that liberals specifically, and I have a growing distaste of, I don't know if you saw my post, the liberals are not leftist post, but I did see that.
I like that one. That wasn't the two people in bed, or I don't know. Anyway,
it's from an anime. It is, but the biggest thing is that and my distaste for the liberals is that they co-opt a dangerous mission, right? They cling on to these bandage solutions. They cling on to these things because and specifically liberal politicians, because it's easier to market queerness. It's easier to market queerness and market queer acceptance than it is to actually be a liberator of queerness, right?
Yeah.
It's easier to put a gay person on a shirt than it is to say that the murders of gay people need to stop, and that we need to actually foundationally address these issues on a systemic level, right? So it's not, so this is the thing, right? The cultural battle between Republicans and Democrats, right? There's four groups of people. There's the alt-right, which is insane and crazy, and their ideas are unequivocally and admittedly in all part, right? They don't even say, oh, we believe in strong, super strong government and free capitalism, right? I'm talking about the people who are literally who go out of their way to say they are Nazis, right? Then there is the conservative party, right? The liberal party and the leftist party, right? Or the left, right?
Yeah.
And the left does not foundationally believe in hatred, right? They believe in things that you may disagree on, or things that in praxis you may argue are based on things, but those are based on interpretation. However, the conservatives and the liberals, they are constantly engaged in a battle with themselves, which does not benefit them in any nature, right? It does not. It will never benefit you.
Well, I think doesn't the greed go both ways? Like, people, there's, let's just say there's like a have and have not set, and there's definitely like the have nots that haven't put in the work or haven't taken the risks or whatever, are greedy and jealous of those that have, and they don't want to put in the time. Like, this is actually a question that I wanted to ask you.
See, and that's the thing, is that I would argue, and this is one of the struggling issues.
It may not be with you, but I will tell you. I think there is a challenge with this generation. This is why I think a lot of people are interested in communism, because they want to they just want to burn it down and start over. And I think part of this is because of this instant gratification generation. Like, you want something and you want it now, and I talked through my scenario, and like I worked a long time to get where I am, and now, and I'm not Elon Musk, but I live a comfortable life. I can take care of my family. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And here's the thing, right? Is that when it comes to that, is that a communist who works is usually, or a person who claims to be communist and works is usually someone who is more educated on communism than a person, like in a jokey sense, but these blue-haired white individuals who live with their rich parents and believe in market regulation, right? It's a person who is exploited is always going to be more educated because they actually face the exploitation.
People can believe they're exploited when they're not. Like I've had employees, for example, that they didn't do the greatest work, and they came in and they're like, well, like, how do you feel about giving me a raise? And I'll say, well, you're you're not keeping up with the quota of the thing. And so like, there are people in their own minds, they're thinking that they're exploited, but they may not be, right? Like they may not be. They may just it's a self-perception.
Yeah. And I'd argue that on a systemic level, exploitation occurs, but there are some individuals who have been detached from labor, right? There are some individuals who, and this occurs specifically in low-income communities, is that there is a deconstruction of a cultural deconstruction of how labor is to be produced and how labor is created, right? It's like you look at communities that are redlined, right? You look at poor communities. Why does theft, in terms of personal theft, occur more amongst these communities than other communities?
Culture.
And it's a cultural issue. And a lot of the things, right, is that the Republicans argue is that they say it's a cultural issue, but culture doesn't stem from anywhere. You know what I mean?
I'm still a huge skeptic on communism, but I am very interested. Like, you can tell. Hopefully you can tell. Like, this is coming from a good place. Some of this stuff is pretty advanced. These guys are 11 and 13.
Not to offend you guys, but they were very skeptical. The people I was talking about, they're like, "Oh, they're gonna clip you out of context," and I was like, "No, I've talked to them. They're good faith people, and they seem to." People who are open to actually understanding.
I'm not interested in making you look bad. I'm really interested in understanding.
So, which is something that, you guys were kind of the viewpoint I kind of wanted to go into, because, I looked at people like Kirk, and I looked at people like all those conservative like debaters, and a lot of their arguments are like what people don't notice in terms of like some people don't notice this. The average person doesn't notice this. But a lot of the things they say are not in good faith, right? They're kind of reductionary. Especially you look at someone like Kirk, and Owens is a less of an example of this. I think Owens, she kind of really believes what she says, and Kirk a little bit more. But someone like Ben Shapiro, he kind of like talks really fast, and it's not really in a good faith way, right? He's not really making logical arguments, but the nature of his voice and the way he talks fast kind of makes you believe it more, right?
Some people talk with a really good command over their topic, and it sounds like
whereas I personally believe that education should come from a narrative that helps us. I could talk about this stuff for hours,
I could too. My boys,
hours, almost 3 hours.
The boys are probably getting stir crazy, but I really do enjoy this. I enjoy talking with good faith people. This probably doesn't surprise you, but I have a lot of people that reach out and they're like, I want to come on and debate you. I'm going to crush you and all this. I'm like, whoa, well, this is not good faith. Like, if you said, hey, I'm curious about how you think about such and such, and like what questions you have or what doubts you have, like you did, then I would say like, okay, that's a discussion worth having. But most 9 out of 10 requests that we get are not like that. They're like really, they're biased and hateful in terms of like the way that they come across. But I do think like the world benefits when people can get together and talk about these things. And I think here's something I'll ask you, because I'm not really, maybe no big surprise, I'm not really convinced that communism is like the way. However, there are a number of things that I agree with in terms of how you discuss and see the challenges that we have. I do believe there's a huge wealth disparity, and I do believe that there's a big surplus at the top, but I don't believe it's created by necessarily the billionaires. I believe it's created by the system, or maybe there is some secret oligarchy, bourgeoisie that is out there doing all this. But I think what needs to be addressed and attacked are the systems, and it's the Federal Reserve, right? It is the people standing up and saying, like, I don't know, like, we're not going to pay our taxes until you balance the budget, because every piece of debt that is taken fuels inflation.
Yeah,
and so if people can do that, we need to attack inflation. We need to attack the Federal Reserve, fiat currency, and if we want to really change the wealth gap, the fastest way to do it, in my humble opinion, is address inflation, but bring asset prices down. And there might be things we can do to bring asset prices down. Home values, the stock market is insanely overvalued. And so if the stock market, for example, went down 80%, Elon Musk, his net worth would come down 80%.
Yeah, and I think see, this understanding of things is definitely something that that needs to be discussed. Right now, I kind of want to go back to the cultural thing just so I can stay on topic. So the issue with the culture thing is that there are things that shape these cultures, that shape why low income people are incentivized to steal, right? And I would argue that psychologically, almost everybody and everything, right, is taught everything, right? You are put into a forest and you live amongst foxes and you live amongst wolves. You act like a wolf. You know what I mean? You act like, and this is something that occurs psychologically. Like, people go feral. Like, people don't become human, right? So I think psychologically everything is almost taught. And I think that here's my argument, right? I think that when the value of life is monetized or put on behind the value of an object, right, it becomes bound to that object in a way that is reductionary, right? That incentivizes the increase of that value, the increase of that thing, right? People are attached to that object necessarily, right? So you need money to survive, you need money to live, you need money to exist. And this is more of a philosophical thing, but when you are so attached to money, and when you attach money to human life, right, on a philosophical level, what that generally creates is a conflation with the two, right? So the more money you have, the more life, in a sense, you have, the more opportunities you have, the easier it is to live. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, materialism is well, I mean, that's a thing, but I like, that's, I don't know. I mean, that's like human nature. I think people are drawn to material things, items, progression of
I would argue that
social status and wealth.
In some nature, people are drawn to material wealth, but I'd argue that there are ways to reduce this, right? Is that once where it goes back into the thing is that human nature doesn't derive from a general or a general in terms of biology, right? Humans are ecological creatures. We exist together. We exist unitedly, right?
But do you want to live like, because I think this is an interesting point, like, when I think of indigenous people that live in a communist structure where they're all sharing, there's no, they might trade things and so forth, like you say, but there's no money system and so forth, and you know, their level of happiness and so forth. But I don't see people like going and wanting to live like that after they've seen this, right?
Yeah, and I would say that there are a lot of indigenous people that do want to live like that, and there are indigenous people who live like, most indigenous people are attached to the reserves that they live in, right? And they are opposed to these things. This is like a consensus amongst like things. It's
so why don't because you can live like, as a communist or anarchist, you can live that way in America. You can go and like live that way.
I could in a way, in a sense of the word, live in a commune, right? But there are two reasons I wouldn't live in a commune. One reason specifically is that I'm not done here, right? I could say I'm gonna go leave this system, right? I'm gonna go leave this nation, right? I'm gonna go live in Europe, right? But I don't want to. I want to try to fix
problem.
Huh?
Yeah. Yeah, the same problem.
Yeah, I want to fix the issues that are here. I want to work on the people around me. I don't want to abandon them, right? I could leave America, but that doesn't stop if I'm a middle class citizen, right? An individual who has the ability to travel anywhere else, I could leave, or someone with the ability to travel elsewhere, because there are individuals who don't have that ability and don't have that.
You could live in a communist way here, like in America. I mean, you could.
I'd argue that I try to live in a communist way here in America.
But no, because you're what you're doing.
I don't utilize firsthand things whenever I need. Almost everything I buy is secondhand because I try to minimize the scale of participation in capitalism.
But like, get a group of people together, go out on land, and just live as a communal
and that's
society.
another thing. It's
like there's no laws prevent you from doing that in a capitalist system.
It's not. Well, there are zoning laws and issues like that prevent communes from existing. Like you can't just live.
But they exist. I mean, well, you could say the Amish, but you could say there's I forget the name of them in Vermont. But there are groups that do this in the country.
Yeah, and there are communes that do this, but you know, it's part of that is that once more is that I don't want to. I think that there's work. You want
to force everybody else into your ideology.
I don't want to force everyone else into my.
Well, maybe
ideology.
force is a strong word, but like that's what when I bring this up with communists, I'm like, go do it, go do your thing, and they're like, no, I want you to do it too. The difference is, I will allow you to live however you want. You can live in a communist in my capitalist system. But I'm not forcing you to live as a capitalist, right? Like you can live the way you want. So, I'm not forcing anything upon you, but you want to force your system and ideology onto me. And then as part of it, if I'm too wealthy, you want to confiscate my wealth.
I like that. I think that would be good for the episode. But anyways, I like that point right there. I think here's the thing, right? Is that Matt? So I want you to think about this, right? Is that let's this is what I like to do. I like to use like logical, I like everything logical, right? I like everything with facts. Okay. Right? It's like, so Matt, you go to live in let's say you change it to a communist, right? Mm-hmm. And you go to live in a commune, right?
Okay.
And you're happy like that, and you choose to live like that.
Yeah.
Matt, while you live in the commune, in Syria, there are drone strikes of children that are occurring in order to produce oil outputs. So there are issues going on with other people, and I think that it's immoral to just say, to turn a blind eye, in my opinion, to the issues that are being caused by this capitalistic force, right? That are being brought, and you know, it's going to be a difference of opinion here, but in my view, these are driven by capitalistic force, right? In my literature, in my reading of literature, in my understanding of history, these are driven by that capitalist cause. So while living in a commune is something that I could do and something that general society can do, there are individuals who are not able to do that. There are individuals who are not able to remove themselves from the labor, right? Which is why the communists aren't trying to impose anything on anyone outside of liberation. They are simply saying that liberation should occur, right? That
communism being liberation.
Communism is the lack of a system, right? In a place where a system does not exist, communism requires the lack of a state. Right, specifically, not just a system, but in a place where a system cannot exist, there is no place where exploitation can exist, and
then you don't think there's going to be any drone strikes when you don't have a military or any systems to protect you.
There is no reason for drone strikes to occur in any.
You become highly susceptible to being conquered, though, right? Because like military that's protection is not.
See, which is one of the things, right? Is that sustainability is an issue that we need to tackle, and that there are examples of a tackling towards this, and in some issues, it's in some parts, it's a little harder to argue, and this is kind of a division amongst communists is the difference between one state in socialism in one state versus socialism across the world, right? Marx says specifically, what Marx says is that socialism needs to exist outside of
this is the one world order philosophy, right? This is why they're pushing for it.
So communism needs to exist outside of one state. Now, why does this need to occur? Because the working class needs to liberate itself everywhere in order to prevent the capitalistic forces from combating.
It needs to be a world order, is what you're telling me.
It doesn't need to be a world. Okay, see, that's the thing.
But it needs to be a global thing. It can't just be.
It has to. So that's what. So Marx is saying that it needs to be a global order in order to stop that exploitation from occurring, right?
Marx, the more that I read and understand about him, he reminds me of Emperor Palpatine.
So yeah, Marx was
With total dominance, we will bring peace to the galaxy.
okay. So it's not. Yeah, So
That's what it's like.
Emperor Palpatine, actually, I'd argue Emperor Palpatine is more like, all of the capitalist leaders, and Luke was an anarchist. Luke was combating that empire. So it's not. So here's the thing, right? Is that I'm critical of state capitalist revolutions. I'm critical of these things. I argue with other communists online all day about these things, right? About when they're necessary and when they're not necessary. And I think we need a real historical analysis, but we can't just abandon the cause because some countries have taken bad tolls or have led this or have left to this thing. A few bad apples do not define. So when you look at same thing with the religion, you know what I mean? I don't leave Christ simply because there are a lot of Christians out there that aren't good people. You know what I mean? There are Christians out there that participate in the Crusades. This doesn't mean that Christ himself is inherently negative, but people still choose to believe in Christ, right? So the argument against communism needs to be critiquing how it actually interacts with society, right? How it actually functions and what it's actually doing, and in terms of a real world application of real world communism, right? Or
we have communist elements in our system. Communist and socialist elements in our system, don't you think?
There are no communist elements in our system. I would argue there are some instances where individuals participate in communist action in terms of how they utilize the system. However, these things are not radical enough to say that they're socialist or communist, which is one of the things that individuals aren't understand, that a lot of conservatives don't really understand. They're like, oh, and I actually get into my argument with this dad a lot. He's like, Biden's a communist. I'm like, Biden's nowhere near a communist. Biden is like, Biden funneled like billions of dollars into Israel. How do you think Biden is a communist at all? No communist on the planet would support that. No communist in all of the history of Marx and all of the history of every communist on the planet, no communist would agree with that funneling of economy. No communist would, and even with Obama, Obama opened an oil rig. Under Obama, not Obama specifically, but under Obama, there was an oil rig that was open that was so damaging to the environment. So it's like these people are so detached from the communists. But the reality of the thing is, and the reality of the political situation in America is that politics has become so tied together, right? Is that politics has become so tied together that they think that these minor differences are actually influencing or actually real world or are actually divisions, right? When they're not divisions, they're a consensus amongst politicians on how we should arrive at policy, right? Because at the end of the day, the same policy gets passed, right? The same, whether it is or the same effects of policy get passed, right? At the end of the day, inflation still exists because price gouging still exists, because corporations still influence the thing, because the government still ties into these things. So at these levels, these things still exist. There's just
how does price gouging exist in a free market?
What do you mean?
Well, I don't want to get off too many tangents. So there's a huge challenge with, I think, getting this idea across the line. There's going to be a lot of opposition to this. And maybe a place to start is the areas that conservatives and communists agree on, which is limiting government. And so for me right now, I would love to see us do more and more to limit government, limit political power, limit terms, things like that, so that we don't have people in office for decades becoming wealthy off the system, and that the people have more of a voice in what happens. And so maybe the silver lining is that we can come together on some of that kind of stuff and limit government. And then from there, maybe there are other steps that can be taken. But I feel like there's reasonable steps, and then there's like utopian steps that are like almost too far to even imagine at this point, Yeah. So maybe that's something for us to think about and explore further.
So I'm gonna tell you and the audience two things, right? Is that I want you guys to take this into account, and I want you as well, is that How long have you how old are you? No, no offense, but how old are you?
I'm 49.
49.
I'm 48. 48. Sorry.
48.
48.
How long do you think you will have called yourself a conservative?
High school,
Since
maybe
school?
junior high. Yeah.
Right. So
I would say my son's age.
Yeah. So since junior high, you have called yourself a conservative, and in middle school, I was also a conservative, and I was also educated on this. And then what I did is that I encourage the audience is that you don't just look at one source, right? You don't just look at one piece of information. You have to analyze things more in depth. You can't take things at face value anymore. This is one of the most dangerous things that are occurring as society, is that the idea of and one of the people in the group chat said this, is that he is the believer of common sense. However, common sense still derives from some part of our brain, right? Common sense, even the simple axiom that 1 + 1 = 2 has to be is proved in mathematics, right? And this is how we scientifically understand things, is that we have to look at real world analysis and real world understanding. So my advice to you is, knowing and listening to all of these things that I have said today, is to detach yourself from whatever political ideology you have. Try to exist in a vacuum, right? And from there on, try to understand what is actually going on in historical with the world. And whenever you look at one of your news sources, or whenever you look at the media that you're consuming, look at not just one outlet, but look at the source of media that actually prints out the piece of information that, or actually highlights and shows the piece of information that is being discussed, and is actually reputable. Compare and cross-compare and analyze those sources. When the only way that you will ever be a true communist, or the only way that you will ever arrive to the conclusion that communism is a solution to social ills, or that you need to be communist in praxis, is by reading. There's no way to arrive at communism by being unhistorical or being unfactual, because you will never understand anything, right? You will never understand anything by relying on simple things, or relying on just people's experiences, right? You need to analyze things more contextually. While experiences are a good way of understanding and shaping thought, the actual analysis needs to come from a more general consensus, a more historical analysis, right? That derives itself away from bias. One of the examples, I was actually in your comments section, and I argued with this guy, and I brought up on a multitude of genders, and I brought up an article of Britannica that was actually historically based, and the guy said Britannica is used by instead of refuting it, he was like, Britannica is used by liberals. Look at this Charlie Kirk clip, right? And this in foundation is inherently not a good argument, because one source is a person speaking and another source is academic consensus that actually derives from a long line of analysis, right?
Do you believe, though, that academic consensus is true? Like, I can show you, for example, if you look at the ITEP study on how they analyze Trump's policies, it's a bunch of super liberals that like have been super liberal on social media. Everybody on the like internet ecosphere, it references this study about how bad Trump's policies are for inflation. And it's all like hypothetical what ifs on how tariffs work, how his foreign policy works, how his tax plan will work, how it affects markets and prices. And so I think there is a legitimate rationale to question news sources, where they come from, because people are like, oh, this is ITEP.
Yeah.
Well, if you actually look at who wrote it, the authors, the economists that wrote this thing, they're all a bunch of hacks, okay? And they're super liberal bias liberally. And so they literally wrote it intentionally to try to make Trump look bad. Now, Britannica might be a different kind of a source, but ultimately, like, there is a lot of like risk in some of these sources, and I think people which is why and a lot of people, anyone who's done research, needs to understand that that there are sources that are more critical than others, right? So let's look at one source. One example of this is autism and vaccines, right? The idea that vaccines cause autism
comes from a paper that wasn't really peer reviewed or foundationally.
You've seen the correlation studies, though, right?
Most of the studies and in terms of vaccines and autism are not scientifically backed and are disagreed upon.
But there's a massive. But do you agree that there is a massive, like, and we can do this is where I talk to people about climate change and autism with vaccines. There is a massive correlation of ADHD, autism, and so forth with the onset of mass vaccinations.
Yeah,
okay?
and
now there's also a huge correlation between like ice cream sales and shark attacks.
Yeah,
so it doesn't necessarily mean.
And the thing is that a lot of one thing is that a lot of these correlational studies specifically are done improperly, and two, in terms of autism.
So why do we believe it for climate change but not for autism?
Which is why my point is here, right? Is that study specifically was not peer reviewed. There are systems and ways that we academically actually agree and evaluate things before they're published.
I can tell you, I did peer reviewed studies, and my buddy reviewed my stuff. I reviewed his stuff. Okay, we're all good. Like, these are not, like, you got to be careful. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, and you did studies and they were reviewed by a peer, but peer reviewed specifically has to be by a body of academia,
yes.
right? And
have you ever seen James Lindsay's studies where he studied the dogs and rape culture stuff? I should send that to you. Mm-hmm. You can get anything published.
Yeah,
like you can get anything published, even if it's total made-up garbage.
So here's the thing, right? Bakunin actually speaks about this. He's one of the more prolific anarchist writers. He writes in God and the State, right, that we should only give authority to those that we will, right? And he argues about how the academic body generally has benefits the individual.
They've lost credibility. They've lost all credibility.
They benefit, and I can understand why you don't believe that, but I think that in general, I've seen from my research and from my study, I would disagree with that completely.
And I shouldn't say all, but they have lost a lot of credibility. They've done things that don't make any sense.
I'd argue that there's an oversimplicity. There's an oversimplicity of analysis that the common man struggles to understand in terms of analysis. Like when you look at when you look at a multitude of gender things, a lot of people don't actually understand gender ideology and why that comes to be, right? It's that these things are studied, right? These things do make.
They're studied by people that want it to be real. Okay,
I think that.
Nobody studies nobody studies gender ideology that isn't like wanting a certain outcome from it.
I think there are people who study gender ideology.
Is even studied.
I think it is. I think it's an important sociological study. I think that it's necessary because the way gender interacts is very in large part to certain narratives. Like for example, the multiple genders thing, right? It's this idea that here's the thing, right? It's like one of the misconceptions is what is gender, right? What is gender and how is that opposed to sex? Right. What is the difference?
It's a social construct. I think. That's how it's defined. It didn't used to be, but it has been since the 70s.
Gender. That's the thing, right? Is that we understand gender to be more complex than that, right? So you look at something like gender ideology. You look at something like understanding these things and how they come to be, right? And it's the thing is that they predate Western society. They predate these things. So it's not like we got these things from anywhere. Indigenous people had a multitude of genders. They had
but it would be like me, like Pablo, it'd be like me calling my priest a unique gender because he represents, like both of us in the holy, spirit or whatever. I've looked at some of this stuff and it's mostly like shaman or special people in their society.
Yeah,
and there are societies that have multiple genders. We don't have to go down on this too much, but like it's slivers of cultures, like pretty much all of Western, Asian, African, Latin America, like they're two gender histories as far back as you can find. But nonetheless, like I don't really care if what people want to call themselves, but I think it's kind of silly. Like if I came up with a term, let's just say I came up with a term right now, I'm going to call it snarf. Snarf is how old I feel. I feel 72. So based on my snarf identity, I want to collect Social Security. Now it's not my biological age. That need be age, right?
Yeah.
So like that's a straw man, that's what has happened with gender. It's taking control of language to manipulate people.
So there's two things, right? Is that
nobody cares. By the way, nobody cares if somebody wants to dress up as a girl outside of children. We don't care if somebody wants to be gay, bi, lesbian, whatever. We don't care if you want to dress up as more feminine or more masculine, whatever. But when you start compelling my understanding of the world and compelling language and forcing me to say things and put things in my bio, like that's where, or trying to go after children, like this is where that community has lost us. And I think they've, unfortunately, it's like they've gone way too far and now nobody's like on board with it.
So here's the thing, right? Is that, and this is why we need bring real wokeness back into America back again. Okay, real. And when I say real wokeness, I mean the wokeness that came from the Black Panthers, right? White people, not to get into race, but usually white liberals have taken that term and reconstructed it to have an individual meaning where they are co-opting, a misunderstanding. They're co-opting it, right? They're
taking advantage of it.
Yeah. They don't actually want queer liberation. What they want is to market off queer liberation. Right?
Yes.
They want to put rainbows on shirt, and in the same branch they want to continue the cycle of oppression that occurs under queer people. They don't actually want to do anything about it. They just want to sell their t-shirts. And that kind of goes into to rainbow capitalism and why queerness kind of go, even all these different politics kind of go back into the criticism of systems and things like that. But here's the thing, right, is that you look at queer people going into queer people affecting kids, right? It's that there is probably very few individuals in America that actually are queer and want to influence children, right? There are very few individuals in America that are part of queer culture and want to influence children. However, what there is a growing example of and a growing understanding of in terms of queerness is certain queer groups wanting to educate people on the fact that queer people exist, right? That this is a reality of the situation. And that's the issue, right? Is that the liberal mindset is that we don't see color. The liberal mindset, and that has been co-opted by some conservatives as well, but usually liberals say this, is that we don't see color. We don't see this. We don't see that. But the reality of the thing, and the leftist opposes that. He says that it is ignorant to say that you do not see color, right? It is ignorant to say that something does not exist when that thing interacts with people and other things like that. We need to recognize how we interact with race, how we interact with gender. So we can't just say that these things don't exist. We can't just wish them go away. Unfortunately,
I don't think anybody wants them to go away, but they want to use them as a reason to say that they're oppressed. So, for example, race. Like I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and racism is way more prolific now than it was when I grew up.
Yeah, and I think
I had black kids in my school, and it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah,
it wasn't.
I think there are, and I think that this is something that, as a Latin American specifically, is that I have begun to understand. I'm a white Latin American to be clear, right? And growing up, there are certain aspects of racism that I was a little more ignorant to, that I was a little less educated on. I was actually thinking about this the other day, and I have this hatred for Anglo-Saxon white guilt, right? For these individuals who go to protest for black people, and they're like, I'm white and I hate myself. And this is the thing, is that you saying you're white and you hate yourself doesn't do shit. Sorry, I'm cursing on the
yes.
Yeah,
no, but that's true.
Doesn't do anything, right? While you say you are white and you hate yourself, black people die on the street. It doesn't
a virtue
do anything
signaling thing.
Yeah, which is why we need to combat liberal narratives. Is that these things don't actually do anything. They're ultimately reductionary. Right, and I think that I think that we need to the melting ground comes from a unification of individuals, right? The melting ground is when the conservatives and the or the individuals that participate in the working class realize that they are being exploited, that there is a nature of culture and politics that is inherently bound to exploit them, right? It is easier to get a group of people to hate themselves than to, hate a system entirely.
Yeah.
And that's
which is
an
why
issue.
which is why they've brought it. Like, look, I have a theory that has been a massive sort of psyop on America to take us communist, to take us one world order for decades. And part of that has been infiltration of the education systems, hence why young people start like believing in these ideologies. And two is creating identity politics, and it wasn't successful through financial class system. So they started doing it through LGBT and race. And you need that to start propagating communism. You know, Marx, you need people to believe that they're oppressed, right? To propagate communism. And it's all part of like this long game system that they're doing.
I think Matt, this is actually why I kind of enjoy talking with conservatives, especially ones that are in good faith, because they are so close to the consciousness that is necessary to free themselves, because in truth is that the conservatives they're close. They get it in part. They get a lot of it, right? But here's the thing, right? Is that you look at there's two things, right? Is that one of the things you said is true, and then the other one, I think you conflated it with the other one, right? There is a creation of social division through economic division, such as race, gender, and queerness.
Yeah, it wasn't successful enough just based on economics,
LGBT identity.
Yeah.
But however, that division benefits the individuals who are trying to line their pockets more, right? That division, ultimately, it helps the individual who is assisting.
Yes, it's the people that are going to be the ruling class under a communist or heavily socialist to communist system. Those are the people that are going to benefit from this. But in in the way you describe communism is there is no hierarchy or authority, which okay, but these people are setting themselves up, right? Like to be that ruling authoritarian class over essentially a communist world society. And I think a lot of this is done by design. It's hard to not think that when you look at it. And so maybe that's the part you think I'm getting right. I think a lot of it's being done by design, but maybe we think like that they want different outcomes. I think that
that's another thing is that when you said the communists are entering the classroom, I don't know if you've ever set foot in a Florida classroom, but you can't say the word gay in a Florida classroom. You can't.
Well, Florida, maybe.
You can't. I've been in history classes, and this is my personal example, but I've been in history classes where the history teacher can literally have to say, I cannot, and he jokes around about it because we're teenagers. We're obviously, a little more educated than whatever, but he said, I cannot say that racism has continued systemically in America past slavery. So, but yeah, and then he just kind of, he was joking around about it, but he's being for real. He can't say some of these things. So it's like, how is someone who is arguing that slavery has not existed in America? It's like, we don't see, the shift has been more conservative when it comes to education, right? And queerness in class.
I don't know. I think I guess maybe I'm referring to academia, higher education, and so forth. Florida, obviously, like DeSantis cut down. He cut into CRT and DEI, and
which is also one of the more misunderstood things, right? And I actually watched one of your episodes on the CRT guy, and that guy, like, no offense, but all of the stuff he was saying, he said this, and I thought this was hilarious. Actually, he's like, ethnic studies is this, and CRT is that, and ethnic studies is good because of this, while CRT is bad because of that. And I was like, and I've read a lot on CRT, and I don't know if you've ever seen Dr.
But he's an academic. Don't you trust him?
I looked into his paper, and
okay,
he's not a very prominent academic. There's always which is, I am critical of some academia. It just depends on the academia.
Yes.
Yeah. there's just
it's implicit bias. Like people want to know, they want to see the papers and the studies that they want to see. Like that's
however, what he was saying when he said ethnic studies is different is from CRT. CRT derives from ethnic studies. It's not different from ethnic studies. The reason CRT just says that we need to analyze is just a way of analyzing how race implicitly affects society in a way that is critical of it, right? So critical race theory, like it is a way of analyzing that. And when you look at why are people against CRT? Why are people against CRT? It's because one, they don't really understand what CRT is.
It's creating, but it's creating more like identity politics and victim mindset and oppressor versus oppressed. It's propagating Marxist ideologies is what it's doing.
Okay, so
that's why people don't like it.
Okay, here's the thing, right? Is that
Marx needs that. Marx is, he needs
Marx needs consciousness of things that are Marx needs consciousness.
Yes, but real things. This is not
CRT. So here's the thing, right? I want and you've come to me in good faith. You've come to me in good faith so far, right? And I think that a lot of the things you say are. So here's the thing. I'm going to be honest with you. I like you, Mr. Moore. I like you, Mr. Morstad.
I'm enjoying this conversation, but yeah.
A lot of the things you say are in the faith of things you've heard or things that you've analyzed, right, or things that you've perceived, right, and there are some.
What? So, like, I hear this all the time, Pablo, and I'm sorry to interrupt. You have to read Marx, then you'll believe every word of it. I've read some of it, and I still don't believe every word of it.
Yeah.
I've talked to experts that have read it and written books about it, right? And they don't believe it. So not everybody that reads Marx is, like, taken over by the spell of Marx. Have you read Ayn Rand? Have you read Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged?
No, I haven't.
Well, you should read it.
It's
a completely different. It's an objectivist philosophy, but I don't say like, well, if you haven't read it, like you can, I don't know. I think it's a weak argument to say that you have to read all of his works. So you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to read his works, but I'm not convinced that it will change my mind because I have a living example of why Marx philosophies don't work.
So once more it goes more into what I'm saying, and I think that reading. So here's the thing. I actually, before you read Marx, I think there's other people you should read. And I think
don't tell me Engels.
Not Engels, not Engels. They're kind of that's Marx's sugar daddy. But anyways, yeah. So going. I think that. You need to. Communism doesn't take Marx to become a communist, right? I was a communist long before I read Marx. I was a communist when I began to realize. I was a communist when I began to really study history more, right? I was a communist when I began to study the Cuban Revolution more. As a Cuban myself, I took it upon myself to study the Cuban Revolution, and I read the first thing I read was I read the body of literature. That I listened to my father, right? I listened to my father and my mother, and those were two lived experiences, right? Then I read from people in Cuba, right? So then I saw some of their viewpoints too, and I saw the clash between their viewpoints, right? And then after acknowledging people's experiences and acknowledging people's things, I looked into history, right? I looked into the systems, and I realized that
how could you look at history and think communism works?
Because
you have to help me with this.
That's the thing. Hey, Matt, Matt, if you read the history, I promise you're looking.
What history? Tell me what history I need to read.
Matt,
Mao, Stalin, Lenin.
Look at
Cuba, Venezuela.
I want you to read about here's one of the countries where propaganda against it's a little less known. Right, so propaganda has failed against it. Right, so you can read real statistics. There's no the only information against it is some of the French disinformation, and it's widely unacceptable.
How do you know it's disinformation? How do you know it's like?
Oh,
how do you know what's correct and what's not? You say you read history, but only this history is what you should read.
See,
Matt.
okay, so the thing
how do you know?
is you see, that's the thing is that we have to analyze where is the history coming from, right? So there are some, and another thing is, an example of this in a real world application is, I was talking to my Chinese friend about the cultural genocide of the Uyghurs, right? And there were some independence. I read about certain studies, right? I read certain studies from independent people that were not bound to, independent researchers that had no lens of, that had no reason to be subjective, right? Or sorry, that had no reason to be biased, right? That they simply went into the things and they actually studied it, right? And I looked at those analysis, and then I from that I logically derive what is the correct source of information. And there are ways of doing this. There are methodologies of doing this. One thing is checking where is the peer review, where is the actual study, where is the actual highlighting of this information, where is this information coming from, right? Something. And one of the things that I look at a lot too, when I want to look into a history, or when I want to look into the USSR, or I want to look into, which is one of the regions I'm studying more, the USSR. I'm pretty educated on the Cuba specifically, and this other country is one of the most. I love this country, Burkina Faso. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's an African country.
Yes, I have heard of. Yes.
Yeah, Burkina Faso. It's one of the most. It's one of like the most interesting countries to analyze.
Yes, I actually looked up, like, give me some I think maybe it was ChatGPT or something. I was like, hey, give me some examples where communism works at one point, and I think that was one of them. But these are like, now, like, that's like me saying communism works in my house. Like, it's such a small community.
Yeah,
how do you, like, where it's scale, you know? And you could argue like, oh, it worked for like 5
and you look
years,
at
20,
right, which is why you look at something like Burkina Faso and you analyze it, and it's like, okay, this is a lot easier to digest and analyze, right? So there is some you can. So if you look at a country like Burkina Faso, you can understand, at least it opens your mind up to something, which is where I begin to open my mind up to that. It begins to open your mind to say that would you agree, like, since you've seen that country, would you agree that there are some places where communism has worked?
Yes, but they're not material enough to convince me that it can work on any kind of scale.
Right. So
and have longevity.
Which is part of the beginning, right, of the journey, in my opinion. Part of the journey, it's a
journey to death and misery, man.
The journey to achieving class consciousness. You know,
the journey
we need to.
I think one thing.
Living your life. Listen. The journey to to open your mind up to new ideas. You know, it's one thing to.
I'm here, man. I'm listening to new ideas. Yeah. I hope you appreciate that, and I really am, and I've learned a lot today. But at the same time, I think one thing that would help communists, Marxists, anarchists, like, is you gotta start bringing some of this back into plain speak. When you say you got to understand class consciousness and dialectic of material, like, you're going to lose people right away.
I agree.
You have to be able to put this into plain speak.
Yeah, I agree.
This is why a lot of people look at Marx as he's an eloquent writer and speaker, but it's just a fictional, like, fairy tale.
I think in a lot of spaces, especially like intellectual spaces, is that people they become exclusionary because they're not really focusing on the working class. You know what I mean? So I think you know, coming onto this episode is part of what I believe is uniting the working class in terms of getting young conservatives on, people who are working and actually producing labor, you know, and actually and participate in these things, because the majority of the working class is part of that proletariat, is part of that working class. They're not part of the bourgeoisie, right? The bourgeoisie is a very minimal part of society, and realizing that these individuals need to be more united on this front, and I think so, and I apologize for any of the language I've used that is not plain speaking. Complex.
Well, no, I think, like, it's just when I talk to people on this topic, it's always like, I think you're gonna get more ground and people understand it better if you can sort of, like, bring it into more plain speak. Even when you say, like, when you reference things like, well, you know, labor and so forth, what does that even mean? You know, like it means money to us today. And so I think if you can like refer to it more as something that we can conceptualize, then people will understand it.
I think we should do another episode kind of where we do this in kind of like plain speak and just kind of discuss it like more. And I think that would be a good way and a good method of understanding. Right.
Well, I struggle because I actually think the proletariat exploits the bourgeoisie in a lot of cases. Like they don't have to put up any risk. They can swap jobs whenever they want. They can talk crap about their employees. Like they have a lot of advantages. They have the numbers. You know,
the risk. The thing is we have advantages in numbers, but we don't have advantages in power. You know,
it's an ideology based on jealousy and greed.
Look at you say the proletariat has to take less risk, but you know there are working class people every day who take the risk of sleeping on the street and you know dying of
not ones that are, well, in a communist system we would just let them die, right?
I mean, in a communist system, people who work wouldn't die. Why would in a communist system, if there's food to be distributed amongst individuals, then there's no reason for individuals to die. The argument that I'm making is more in reference to sort of just like an anarchist commune per se. But there's no reason for an individual to die if there's enough food to be.
I think people struggle with it for all of the like common reasons that we've gone over. But
and I think a lot of that comes from you know misunderstanding,
not understanding it, right?
Yeah. Huh?
We don't understand enough.
No, it's not that. It's that.
It's always this. Every time I get into these conversations, it's always like, well, you just don't understand enough yet.
Yeah.
Well, what if in reality you don't understand enough yet? Is that possible?
I think that judging based on, I'd say it's highly unlikely. You know, I'd say, and here's the thing. I'll tell you why.
Your life experience is extremely limited compared to mine.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. It is very limited to yours. But in the same aspect, I like to live and breathe the literature I read. You know, not just. I
do appreciate that. I like how well read you are, and that's great. But that doesn't make it true.
I like to read about theory. I like to read real world analysis. I was a libertarian at first, and then my parents were both like, "You're stupid." I kind of read more onto that, and I recognized why I didn't believe that afterwards. But not because my parents said it, but because I began to read and more understand the historical issues with that, right? And then I was more of a Democrat for like when I was in my younger years, right? And that was more purely based on not reading. That wasn't based on reading. That was based on ideology, right? And that's where it became reductionary. I was just basing what I read. Like it's one thing to say Trump bad, but you have to back up why Trump bad. You know what I mean? You can't just say Trump bad. You can't say Biden good. You can't say all these things. You have to actually give foundational arguments as to why these politicians are good or bad. We have to, and this is something that needs to happen on both policy levels, is that the Democrats need to stop championing Biden. They need to stop worshiping him like a god. They need to stop insulting individuals who refuse to vote for him because of harmful policies that he participated in. They need to recognize that part of the reason that Biden isn't voted for is that he's not giving Americans real solutions. He's not actually he's not solving issues by putting a bandage on them, you know, or by putting these minimal things. And in the same branch, individuals need to stop venerating Trump in the fact that, and I think a lot the veneration and the love for Trump is not one that is systemic, but one that is also motivated ideologically, right? Is that it is surface level, right? It is difficult to understand. And here's the thing, right, is that when I look at something like my dad and who he loves Trump, he keeps talking about, he refers to the gas prices. The gas prices are down. He's like, well, I'm voting for the guy who gets me the best gas prices. And I'm like, well, I don't think that's the primary reason to vote for gas. And for someone who has to pay for gas now, the 10 cents that the gas has gone down since at least from
Yeah.
what I've my viewpoint is not correlating to a reason to vote for him specifically for that. And I understand where that belief comes from, right? So there is an ideological component that drives political forces, right? And part of my AP research paper is actually studying this, is that there is an ideological component that drives an understanding of what we believe, and then there is real world facts and analysis that are foundationally true. And while everything is up to some subjective reasoning, or there is a chance that everything is false and that we are all in the matrix, there are some ways and methodologies. There are some ways and methodologies that we can arrive to a conclusion that things are possibly true, right? That there are some ways that are a lot more concrete than others overall.
Yeah.
And actually that goes back into what you're saying about the USSR, is that my historical analysis of the USSR is beginning to come from different sources, not just one sources. So I'm reading where sources disagree with each other and where the academic consensus is on with historians. And I'm reading between the lines of what historians are saying, right? So a lot of times, even the most biased historians, right? Even the most right-wing conservative historians have to face peer review, right? They have to say, yo, where are you getting the statistic from, right? Is this an accepted piece of literature amongst scholars, right? And one of the things that I noticed is that even the most biased authors avoid a usage of incorrectness. Real historians, or real accurate historians, avoid an incorrectness in terms of historics for the USSR, and those that do utilize them are ostracized and criticized by other historians, and generally not accepted in the academic body of scholarship. And in terms of Russia, in terms of the USSR, even the most biased historians admit in part that there are certain things that, or don't admit in part, but rather focus on certain issues while being critical of the USSR, but still being accurate to those things. And those are the people I'm reading from. Those are the people that I'm beginning to understand. One of the things I was studying is the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, which is one of the most discussed things. And one of the things I came to the realization after reading the body of literature on it is that, in part, a lot of those famines were man-made, but they were man-made by kulaks, right? Which were farmers or not farmers, but rather landowners who did not want to give up their land, who did not want to achieve these things, who did not want to participate in these things. So or who were revolting against the system, not necessarily Stalin who was doing it, right? And that's not to say I'm not critical of other aspects.
Policies, yeah.
I'm not critical of his policies or the revisionist movements at all. But I realize, and another part of that too, is that the area in Ukraine that Holodomor occurred was susceptible to famines, was susceptible to drought, and was susceptible to these other factors. And that's the thing. That's what's so complex about history, is that when you look when you look at something like the U.S.
Even if we say there's no deaths under communism, let's just say there's none. They all failed.
I would argue. Well, what does failure mean to you?
They're not in existence. They've all gone to free market systems. Even China.
Well, I don't see anybody. I'd argue that Cuba has not gone to a free market system.
Okay.
Or Cuba's not
doing great. I wouldn't say they're doing great.
Cuba's not going in the direction of not going in the direction of a free market system, and they have resisted U.S. imperialism over the past few years.
Okay. Well, I mean.
So I wouldn't say.
I think it's a tough. I think if you try to use history as your defense on this, I think it's a tough sell.
I think
that's just feedback. I think it's just a tough sell.
And that's the thing is that we have to come to these things where and I recommend this to you as well, the audience, is that when you want to look into when you're in opposition to communism, if and I want to ask you this, right? Do you ever think in reality, right? And I want you to exist in a vacuum. Do you ever think there's a reality where you'd ever be a communist, or where you'd ever, if you agreed with the ideas and you agreed with the historics of it and you agreed with praxis and application, do you think there's a world where you'd be a communist?
Well, of course, if I agreed with all that, then I would be a communist.
Yeah, exactly. So
I don't find myself agreeing with it though.
Yeah. So here's what I'd say.
I'm not convinced.
Yeah, I'd say to you in the audience. I'd say, go to your communist friends. Go. If you're diametrically opposed to communism, and in a historical sense, right? Go to your communist friends. Ask them about the historics of a situation. Specifically, go to your Marxist-Leninist friends. Your anarchist friends, they might be a little less helpful because they're opposed to a lot of things. But anyways, go to your Marxist-Leninist friends and ask them questions about the historics, right? And then ask them to give you a source, or ask them, or bring your own sources, and then analyze those sources yourself, right? Look into, don't just do a self-analysis where you're logically analyzing everything, because although that can be useful, utilize other academic consensus, and when it comes to empirics, formulate a truth factor to those empirics, right? When it comes to ideology, sure, take into account the body of literature, but formulate your own ideology based on what you're reading and what you're educating yourself on, right? Formulate your own body of ideology based on not just your own experiences, because if you live only based on your own experiences, then you might become susceptible to ignorant of other people's experiences, right? The issues I face as a Latin American man are different from the issues of a person might face as a black man, right? So I might become ignorant just by saying, oh, well, my way of life is right because this is how I experience life, right? Because other individuals might experience life a little bit differently. So, and that's something that I think is necessary or common in communist spaces, that they invite a lot of groups of people to communicate their issues and communicate how these things are formulating. And there's more of a free exchange of ideas, amongst communists.
Let's do this. Let's call it a wrap with that. I think it was a good sort of encouragement to reach across the aisle, learn more, and research more to make good conclusions. I think that's a great thing to do, regardless of which side you're on. So why don't we call the podcast a wrap with that today? We went into a lot of depth today. It was fascinating. I appreciate it. I appreciate you spending time with us in good faith, of course. And I think we learned, our audience will learn. So I appreciate that a lot.